Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the FCC-FTC Policy Forum on Fighting the Scourge of Illegal Robocalls. I'm Patrick Weber, Chief of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau here at the FCC. We are very pleased to join forces with the FTC to further the fight against illegal robocalls and caller ID spoofing. Unwanted calls are a major source of complaints to both the FCC and the FTC, and we look forward to the policy discussions today that will address ways to protect consumers and encourage the development of private sector solutions. This morning, we will hear remarks from FCC and FTC leadership. We will also hear from a diverse group of speakers on 3 moderated panels focusing on challenges facing consumers and industry today, recent regulatory and enforcement efforts, solutions and tools for consumers. Today's policy forum is being streamed live with captions on the FCC's website and will be posted for later viewing once complete. And with that, it is a great pleasure to introduce our first featured speaker, FCC Chairman Ajit Pai. Mr. Chairman.
Thanks so much, Patrick. Good morning, and welcome to the FCC. Thank you all for coming. I apologize at the outset. I'm in the midst of a cold, so I've been alternating today between sounding like Barry White and Katharine Hepburn, but nonetheless, I will persist. Special thanks to our co-host, the terrific team from the FTC, and their fearless leader, my friend, Acting Chairwoman Maureen Olhausen, who I understand will be appearing by video. She's not able to be here in person today. Thank you as well to my colleagues, Mignon Clyburn and Brendan Carr, for taking the time to be here and speak this morning. This cross-agency event reflects the importance of the issue of unwanted robocalls. For years, this has generated the most consumer complaints here at the FCC, and I know that our companions at the Federal Trade Commission have gotten a lot of feedback about it as well. Today's collaboration brings together not only the FCC and the FTC, but also other leaders in government, the private sector, and the nonprofit community. It's a group effort, one that is necessary and appropriate to tackle this challenging issue. It evokes in my mind Ben Franklin's famous quote upon signing the Declaration of Independence in 1776. We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately. Now, to be sure, this is perhaps a less existential issue than the one Franklin was facing, but nonetheless, the fight against unwanted robocalls requires a similar unity. None of us will defeat this scourge alone. The unfortunate inventiveness of scammers, technical challenges, and the sheer volume of calls that are being unleashed on American consumers are daunting for any one entity to defeat. But working together, I think we have a better chance. Here at the FCC, combating unwanted robocalls is our top consumer protection priority. And we've taken multiple steps over the past year to advance that priority. For instance, last November, the FCC empowered phone companies to block calls from spoofed phone numbers that do not or cannot actually originate calls, such as invalid or unassigned phone numbers. Now, this allows phone companies to block many scam calls before they even get to consumers. Additionally, we are seeking public input on ways to help authenticate caller ID information. This would essentially give each phone number a verified digital fingerprint that would give every call recipient the confidence to answer, knowing a legitimate caller was on the line. And just yesterday, the FCC launched an initiative to explore the creation of a database for reassigned phone numbers, a measure that would help reduce unwanted calls to consumers. Now, the FCC's focus hasn't been limited to the rulemaking side of the ledger alone. Aggressive enforcement also has been a key component of our strategy. We've sent a very clear message that those who engage in illegal robocall schemes will pay a price, literally. In 2017, the FCC proposed over $200 million in fines against illegal robocallers, including the largest single fine ever proposed in the history of this agency. I've also personally raised this issue with some of my foreign counterparts to enable our governments to share information that is necessary to crack down on organized illegal robocalling operations. But we all know that this isn't enough, and that is why we've teamed up with the FTC, with consumer advocates, and with the private sector to convene this policy forum. We are looking to you for guidance on the steps we have already taken and what steps we need to take in the future in order to protect consumers. I should note as well that this event will not be a one-hit wonder. On April 23rd, the FCC and FTC will again be co-hosting an event, this time a technology expo that will feature technologies, devices, and applications that seek to minimize or eliminate the number of unwanted robocalls that consumers receive. The expo will be held at the Pepco Edison Place Gallery here in Washington, D.C. We certainly hope that those of you here in the audience and those watching will be able to attend. With that, thanks again for joining us today, looking at the talent in this room, many of whom I've had the chance to work with over the past couple of years on this issue. I know that this is going to be an engaging and productive day, and at the end of it, to borrow once again from Franklin, I'm quite confident that we will all hang together in this fight. So thank you for your attention, and with that, I will turn it back to Patrick to set us on our schedule. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next featured speaker is FTC Acting Chairman Maureen Ehlhausen. She will be delivering her remarks via pre-recorded video.
Thank you for coming to today's Robocall Forum. While I can't join you in person, I'm thrilled that the FTC and the FCC are co-hosting this event to explore the problem of illegal robocalls. And thank you to FCC Chairman Ajit Pai and to FCC and FTC staff who made this possible. Like you, I hate when my phone rings due to an illegal robocall. Now, this problem isn't new, but it does seem to come in waves. In the late 2000s, we saw that robocalls were a growing problem, and the FTC responded by amending the telemarketing sales rule to prohibit the vast majority of robocalls or pre-recorded sales calls. Unfortunately, changes in telephone technology, primarily the growth of Voice over Internet Protocol, or VoIP, and automated dialing software, have made it much easier for telemarketers to make large volumes of robocalls with spoofed caller ID information for a fraction of a cent per call, often from foreign countries, with nothing more than a computer and an internet connection. Each of these developments has made it easier and more profitable for robocallers to violate the law, and harder for law enforcement to stop them, and that means more calls and negative effects for consumers. The FTC uses every tool at our disposal to combat the challenge of robocalls: aggressive law enforcement, initiatives to spur technological solutions, and robust consumer and business outreach. And let me touch on each. The FTC's robocall and do not call enforcement program has two prongs. First, our fraud program targets scams that use robocalls to commit fraud. Not only are such calls annoying, they cause significant financial injury to many individuals. For example, in 2017, consumers reported losing $290 million from frauds perpetrated over the phone. Second, our program against abusive telemarketing strategically targets the parties most responsible for robocalls: the companies that sit at the top of affiliate telemarketing networks, and the robocall kingpins who run the dialers that blast out robocalls across a wide range of industries. To date, the FTC has brought 134 lawsuits against 789 companies and individuals alleged to be responsible for placing billions of unwanted telemarketing calls to consumers. The FTC has been awarded judgments totaling over $1.5 billion and has collected over $121 million from these violators. During my tenure as acting chairman, our enforcement stopped two companies responsible for more than 1 billion robocalls a year. And in June 2017, the DOJ, on behalf of the FTC, along with state co-plaintiffs, obtained the largest penalty ever issued in a do-not-call case: $280 million against Dish Network, as well as strong injunctive relief. Our enforcement efforts remain active and aggressive, although there is always more to be done. Now turning to industry outreach and technological solutions. The FTC has been especially creative and has had tremendous impact encouraging industry initiatives to tackle unlawful robocalls through our public challenges, and more recently through our data initiative. The FTC has led 4 public challenges, really innovation contests, to spur the development of robocall blocking tools. 2 winners of the FTC challenges, Nomo Robo and Teltec, now offer leading call blocking apps. Before the FTC's first challenge, announced in 2012, there were very few call blocking solutions available on the market. Today, there are many, particularly for wireless devices and cable or VoIP phones. As I mentioned, the FTC recently began a new initiative to help facilitate industry call blocking solutions by increasing the amount and frequency of consumer complaint data that we make publicly available. When consumers report do not call or robocall violations to the agency, the phone numbers consumers report are now released each business day to help telecommunications carriers and other industry partners implement call blocking solutions for consumers. The FTC also now releases more data about the call, including the date and the time the unwanted call was received, its general subject matter, and whether it was a robocall. Several telecom carriers have told us that sharing this data has enhanced their ability to block fraudulent or illegal calls. Finally, because robocalls affect so many people, it is important to get the word out about what individuals can do. The FTC's education and outreach program reaches tens of millions of people a year through our website, the media, and partner organizations that disseminate the FTC's consumer information. In the case of robocalls, our advice is simple. If you answer a call and hear an unwanted recorded sales message, just hang up. And be aware that there are call blocking and labeling solutions that might reduce the number of unwanted calls you receive. Indeed, on April 23rd, the FTC and FCC are hosting a public event to showcase some of these new solutions. I know that consumers want these abusive and often fraudulent calls to stop. The FTC's enforcement, innovation, and education efforts are substantial and ongoing, but we can do more. That's why, together with the FCC and other partners, we're expanding the fight to hang up on the robocall scourge. Today's forum is part of that expanding fight, but much more is to come. Stay tuned, and thank you.
And thank you to Acting Chairman Olhausen. Our next featured speaker is FCC Commissioner Mignon Clyburn. Commissioner Clyburn.
Sorry, it's further than I thought. Good morning again, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to take part in today's conversation on combating illegal robocalls. I am pleased to see regulators, industry leaders, and consumer groups come together to discuss the regulatory hurdles posed by these illegal calls that have annoyed countless consumers and scammed millions of Americans. To put it bluntly, robocalls are out of control, and we have the consumer complaints to prove it. We each have had our encounters with robocalls. So I think it is fair to say this morning that we share the same feelings about them. The scenario is a common one. The phone rings. You pick it up, then you notice that distinct pause. You sigh, because within seconds, that recording offering you a free vacation to the Caribbean comes across the phone. Now, when experiencing a mid-March blizzard in D.C. is more attractive than an offer to the Caribbean, we all know we have a problem. Increasingly, however, these nuisance calls are coming from spoofed numbers from seemingly familiar numbers. Advancements in technology have enabled robocalls at a scale we simply have not seen before. The techniques used by robocallers are becoming increasingly sophisticated. They are even experimenting with artificial intelligence that allows the robot to hold convincing conversations. According to the latest report from UMail Robocall Index, the chairman might have touched this, and you know this too, 2.7 billion of those calls were placed nationwide just last month. Equally remarkable is that 4 phone numbers are responsible for more than 68 million of these calls. So given the severity and complexity of the unwanted robocall problem, the FCC and FTC, along with industry stakeholders and all of you, we're coming together to create clear, enforceable rules and to encourage the creation of smart private sector solutions. I agree fully with the conclusion of the Robocall Strike Task Force that robocalls are best addressed in a holistic manner through deployment of a wide variety of tools by a broad range of stakeholders. This is why I'm particularly heartened to see a portion of today's events devoted to solutions and tools for consumers. While I believe the FCC can and must do more to abate this persistent nuisance, there is also room for third parties and all stakeholders to create resources to empower consumers. I admire industry efforts to develop caller ID authentication and the work of businesses providing blocking services such as Nomoro and you know what I'm saying, Nomoro, and I know I messed that up, and Umail. I'm sorry, I'm in another plane right now. The robocalls are driving me crazy. Efforts such as these highlight that there is room and a need for new and innovative solutions. And I believe collaboration between the parties in this room will be key. So I look forward to hearing a report of the conversations taking place today, and I stand ready, as always, to work with you in support of policies and initiatives that put consumers first. Thank you again.
Thank you, Commissioner Clyburn. We're going to go ahead and start with our first panel. That is going to be moderated by Michael Caldwell. She is special counsel in my office in the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau here at the FCC. And the panel is entitled Challenges Facing Consumers and Industry Today. So I invite the panelists to come up, and Micah.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Very pleased to be here and very pleased to welcome for our first panel Michelle Schuster, Kevin Ruppe, and Ed Bartholomew. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and then we'll get started. Michelle, would you like to go first?
Good morning. I'm Michelle Schuster. I'm a former consumer protection chief from the Ohio Attorney General's office. 11 years ago, I started a law firm, McMurray & Schuster, with 3 other consumer protection chiefs and a former Ohio Attorney General. And while I'm here representing the industry, at heart, I would consider myself a consumer advocate as well. I'm here in my capacity as general counsel for PACE, the Professional Association for Customer Engagement. PACE is the only industry nonprofit association that is dedicated solely to contact centers that place calls to consumers and businesses and use multiple channels for contacting consumers and business, including telephones, text message, social media, chat, and those types of avenues. I'm happy to be here today.
Good morning. My name is Kevin Ruppe. I'm the Vice President of Law and Policy for U.S. Telecom, the Broadband Association. Our member companies represent, traditional wireline broadband companies from small rural providers to, some of the largest providers in the country. Robocalls has been a priority issue for our member companies, for our association over the last several years. And I am thrilled to be here. I want to thank Chairman Pai and Acting Chairman Olhausen for bringing this important forum together. And I do want to reiterate something that Chairman Pai said that I wholeheartedly agree with. This is a joint effort. So this is something that industry, consumer groups, government, we all have to cooperate, work together on this issue. And I do feel, having worked on this issue over the last several years, I do feel like there is a tremendous amount of unity with all of those sectors moving in the same direction and in the right direction. And I'm looking forward to talking about everything that's been going on.
Ed Bartholomew with Call for Action. I'll start by echoing Kevin's appreciation to FCC and FCC leadership and also staff for organizing today's event, and look forward to participating. Call for Action is a national nonprofit network that partners with media outlets in cities throughout the country to set up volunteer-staffed consumer help hotlines. And over the past couple years, it's been interesting in terms of robocalls because we can't do mediation to get people resolutions, but what we have seen is that our offices can actually sort of track where the predictive dialers are calling. So one day our Colorado Springs office might get a rash of IRS-related scams, and then nothing the next day, and it's on to Atlanta or a different area of the country where we have a consumer help hotline. So it's been a unique situation in terms of the spike to traffic into our networks that robocalls produce, but it's also been fascinating to sort of watch how some of this has evolved based on what we're hearing from consumers. Another hat that I have the great pleasure and opportunity to wear currently is that of chairing the FCC's Consumer Advisory Committee. And Kevin and I actually currently co-chair the Robocall working group on that advisory committee. And over the past year and a month or so of our term, we've passed, I think, 3 recommendations. All of those recommendations had a number of different action items for the FCC to pursue, and I'm very happy to say that the Commission and Commission staff have been working very closely with our membership to make a lot of those action items come into fruition and become a reality. So that's been exciting, too.
Thank you for being here this morning again. So let's go ahead and get started with our panel. This first panel is about challenges facing consumers and industry today. The intent of the panel is to sort of set the foundation for the other 2 panels that come later this morning that will get into some of the details about each of these areas. I think we just want to sort of scratch the surface with this first panel and give an overview of the problem as we see it. So the first question that I have for you all, and I will direct it to both Ed and Kevin. I read an article in the New York Times this morning that says that the robocalls problem is getting worse. So I'd like to get your perspectives on that. What is the extent of the illegal robocalls problem, and is it getting better or worse?
Sure. I think that the New York Times is pretty spot on with the sense that it's getting worse, and I think the FTC numbers definitely bear that out. I think in 2017 they showed 4.5 million complaints. In 2016, 3.4. So it's rising. The complaint numbers are rising by over 1 million complaints a year. And that bears out if you go back even further in those statistics. And that's despite the fact that there are so many tools and resources for consumers now in the market. I mean, AT&T announced, I think yesterday or recently, that they've blocked 3.5 billion calls. I know that my cell phone provider, T-Mobile, tells me scam likely when my phone rings, and I'm not going to answer that. So there are tools out there that are causing consumers to not have to deal with this, and yet complaints are still on the rise. So I think the only conclusion we can reach is that numbers are going up and losses are going up. Consumers Union reports that this is a $9.5 billion cost to our economy in money lost through these scams and phone calls.
Kevin?
Yeah, so I think I'd echo a lot of what Ed says there, and a couple things. I mean, I don't think it's any surprise that robocalls are the number one consumer complaint at both the FCC and the FTC. And we've heard a lot of numbers thrown out there, whether it's 2.5 billion last month or 2.1 or 2.7. I don't know what the number is. I don't think anybody can say with certainty what the number is, but it's a lot of calls. It's too many. And I think this has been an ongoing problem over the last several years. As I said, number one consumer complaint. But at the same time, I do think it's important that there has been a lot of good progress on this front for consumers, and there are a lot of good things that are happening out there. And in the time I've been working on this issue, 5 or 6 years, one of the things that you're seeing that you'll hear a lot about today. There are more tools available to consumers today. There are an increasing number of tools that are available across multiple platforms, wireline, wireless, cable, VoIP, etc. That's a good thing. There is more partnering taking place. So in other words, you are seeing that, the FCC passed the order last month that, gives carriers the ability to block categories of calls. That's a good thing. You're hearing about AT&T that's blocked 3.5 billion calls. Those are 3.5 billion fewer calls that we're able to connect with consumers, and that's a good thing. There's progress being made on things like Shaken and Stir, where you've seen the standards adopted. They were accelerated by 6 months because of the industry-led strike force. We're going through testing. That is not to say that everything's great. There is a lot of work that still needs to be done. This still is the number one consumer complaint. But I just think it's important that we not lose sight of a lot of the very good progress that's being made. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to continue to move in that direction.
Micah, if I could just add
Sure.
one thing to that. So, you overlay with the increase in consumer complaints about robocalls, the comments that the FCC received from industry on this issue. What we're also experiencing recently is a significant rise in call completions not occurring. So industry has testified to or provided information to the FCC that says that we've seen a drop of about 20 to 30% from legitimate businesses in America as a result of the calling and labeling that's occurring. And so while industry wholeheartedly supports taking a strong stance against robocalls, which are to the detriment of legitimate businesses as well, because it's deterring consumers and businesses alike from picking up the phone for calls they desire and they want to receive. So I think we have to be mindful as we're proceeding forward in our zeal to eliminate robocalls that there are effects to legitimate businesses that also have to be considered.
Thanks, Michelle. Yes, that's very true. So it sounds like we're all in agreement that it's an increasing problem and that there are more tools available now than ever. But what's leading to an increase despite the fact that there have been these really positive developments? Why are we seeing more and more robocalls? So Kevin and Ed, could you speak to that as well?
Sure. So, I think Chairman Olhausen, hit the nail on the head when she talked about that. And she noted the two things. You have advances in technology. The way I look at it, you've had as industry has transitioned to IP-enabled networks. You've had this, what I refer to as a merging of the internet with the PSTN, the Public Switch Telephone Network. And because of that, you've created kind of a vehicle whereby it's much easier to inject those calls into the network. The second piece of that I think is important to note is that, as Chairman Olhausen noted, it is extremely cheap to make phone calls. We're talking fractions of a penny. So that has, created this environment where you can generate a tremendous amount of phone calls at minimal cost. So that's one of the key factors that's contributed to this. The other factor that's contributed to this is the fallibility of caller ID. Okay, so caller ID is very, very easy to spoof, and that's what the scammers are doing. They're able to spoof these numbers and create a false sense of trust amongst consumers that might, compel them to pick up the phone or make them more inclined to pick up the phone. Now, as I said before, the good news there is that industry has developed standards. They accelerated those standards by 6 months. They're going through testing. It's this whole shake and stir standards and best practices that you've heard about. And I think, one of the important things, there's a couple of important things to note about Shake and Stir. That will help to reintroduce trust into the caller ID system so that when that number says, here's who's calling, that's who's calling. And I think an important thing to note, and Michelle hit on this, we talk about robocalls. But I really like to focus on illegal robocalls because Michelle's right. There is a lot of legitimate traffic that gets thrown under this robocall umbrella, things like school closings, doctor reminders, calls from companies that you have relationships with. We want to basically separate those two, get rid of the illegal robocalls, and help these, valid, legitimate robocalls or calls to get through. And caller ID can do that. Authenticated caller ID can help to do that.
Sure.
I would add, too, I think another thing that's driving this is the success rate, right? I mean, the people who are making these calls, the fraudsters, the criminals, they're getting a monetary payout. So it is worth their while to keep this going. Kevin pointed out that it costs less than a penny to place these calls. When you calculate some of the fines that have been issued and divide it by the number of calls that were placed, the fines are less than a penny per call. So you're looking at a scenario where between the cost of making the call and the potential fine, you're still spending less than a penny per call to perpetrate these scams on consumers and to swindle them out of money. So I think that's a huge driving factor in why this continues. And one of the reasons why we started to talk recently about maybe there should be a criminal element here where people spend some time in prison as a consequence for the scam calls that they're making.
And Ed literally took the words out of my mouth. I couldn't agree with that more. And a couple of other things. Like, we collectively, industry, whether it's, voice providers or all the different, companies out there like First Orion, Haya, Umail, we want to, and I think we are, making it more expensive and more challenging for these illegal actors to make calls. In other words, the more costly you make it for them to try to, carry these things out, that makes it less profitable. And at the end of the day, we want to remove that component. But I do have to echo what Ed said. I would strongly support, and industry would be ready to partner with our partners in the federal government on helping to identify these bad actors and bringing criminal enforcement.
I think we probably do have criminal penalties already. If people are perpetrating frauds, there would be crimes that apply to that. So I think there's already the tools there for those types of telephone calls. As we're looking at eliminating the robocalls, and again, something that we all support and all are aligned with, and as we are looking at the members of the industry that are being affected by the calling and labeling, I think it's really important that two things happen in this ecosystem that now exists with blocking and labeling in it. It's very important that legitimate businesses know if their phone numbers are being called or labeled. Currently, there doesn't exist an easy mechanism for legitimate callers to identify that is happening. There is currently technology in place that would provide an intercept code for businesses to receive notice that their calls are being blocked. It's been around since the 1950s. I think it's a workable solution for notifying businesses. Also, for companies that are notified that their calls are being labeled or blocked, they need an easy remediation route so that they can contact somebody. And you need to understand that if a company's numbers are being blocked, a legitimate company that has invested significantly in complying with the TCPA or the TSR, right now they could have a number of different parties that they would have to contact. One of many telecom carriers that are out there. It could be one of many analytics companies that are working with them, other service providers. And there is no easy mechanism for a legitimate business to contact somebody and rectify a situation where calls are being wrongfully blocked, legitimate calls are being wrongfully blocked or labeled. So we really we encourage that as the FCC and the FTC are moving forward looking for solutions. And
just to put a finishing point on that, I do think it's important to note, and PACE and U.S. Telecom have both conducted industry collaborative workshops and efforts to address that issue, because that's an important issue. And making sure that these legitimate call originators can get problems fixed where those false positives arise. But that's something, my sense is that is something that all sectors of the industry are invested in and committed to.
All right. Thanks for that. Oh, did you have something else, Michelle?
I would just, ask as we're moving forward that would be, an important consideration quickly. We have been meeting with industry groups and consumer advocates and with telecom carriers and service providers for probably about a year now without a solution. And I just really want to put an emphasis on the fact that the need for this to happen quickly is of paramount importance.
So, Michelle, could you tell us a little bit more about, we've been focusing so far on the illegal robocalls problem, but
Sure.
You speak from the perspective of someone who represents the industry that's trying to reach consumers with legitimate robocalls. And so I'd like to sort of talk about some of the benefits that consumers get from calls from your organizations that you represent.
Sure. So, for the legitimate businesses and the good actors out there, the technology that we have available to reach a number of people in a short period of time is a very good thing. There are a lot of types of calls that consumers and businesses want to receive using this technology. Things like appointment reminders, service delivery reminders, pharmacy refill reminders, there's school closing. I mean, there's just a number of different good reasons and good uses for this type of technology. In the marketing world, if you can call more efficiently people that have requested and given their consent to be called, that's a more efficient process for business and consumers as well. So there are a lot of really great applications for the technology. The unfortunate reality is this same good technology for legitimate industry has become really a weapon that is being used to really be a scourge for American citizens for these illegal calls that are happening. And those types of calls really need to be distinguished from legitimate calls that businesses are making to consumers who oftentimes want to receive those calls.
Right. So from the industry's perspective, Kevin, what are some of the challenges that the providers run into when it comes to trying to decipher between legitimate calls and illegal robocalls?
Well, so on that point, I think there's a couple of important things to note. I always break down when you're looking at industry sectors that are operating in this space. You have the FCC's order that authorized voice providers to conduct blocking basically at the network level on 4 categories of calls. And those are discrete, narrowly defined categories. It's do not originate, it's invalid numbers, unassigned or unallocated numbers. So, in that category, you have what are basically, identifiable numbers that can be blocked. When you start looking at the other industry sectors like Haya, like First Orion, like Umail, like Nomorobo, there is broader latitude for the categories of calls that they can block. And I know, having participated in a lot of these industry forums, they put tremendous effort into looking at multiple characteristics to make sure that when they do decide to flag that call or score that call, that they get it right. But I do think, Michelle is right that even in that instance, we do want to make sure that there is a mechanism whereby when an instance of a false positive arises, that can be addressed, that it can be resolved quickly and efficiently. And there's a lot of different ways that you can go with that. And that is a lot of the discussion that's happening. And, I know U.S. Telecom, we've had one initial workshop in October of this year to discuss this exact issue. We've scheduled the second for May 4th here in Washington, D.C. I know PACE has similar efforts going on. But I think there is definitely a commitment to, move in that direction to develop industry solutions to make sure we get it right.
And I would say, I think, too, we're obviously all in agreement that illegal robocalls need to be stopped and that that's a problem. But I think the prevalence of and the volume of the illegal calls has put consumers in this position of frustration. It's put consumer advocates, it's put FCC chair and FTC chair people in the position of saying, just hang up the phone, or don't answer the call if you don't recognize the number. So that does create a scenario where it's difficult for calls that have valuable information, like a potential school closing, to break through. Having said that, I do think that when a consumer makes a conscious choice to sign up for a product or service offering like a Hiya or a Nomo Robo, that's an exercise of choice on their part, and they're saying, I'm entrusting this other group to make certain screening decisions for me. Now, I do think it's very important for groups that are engaging in that sort of offering to be very clear and transparent about what they're offering and what could potentially be caught in the net, so that consumers are making an informed consent choice when they decide to enroll for something like that. But I do think we can't sort of overlook that this is one way that consumers are exercising some choice about the types of interactions they want to receive.
Thank you, Ed. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the solution some more, and I think one of the things that factors into this is information sharing. One of the things that Acting Chairman Oldhausen mentioned was that complaint data and putting the complaint data out there so that third-party applications can use it for their call blocking and filtering solutions. But is there other types of information sharing that could be going on in the private sector among industry and providers to help develop some of these products and more solutions for consumers?
So on the information sharing, I think, I applaud what both the FCC and FTC have done in terms of sharing that information. I think previously that information was being released on like a monthly basis, and it's now on a daily basis. And look, at the end of the day, timeliness on this information is key, especially for the analytics developers who are scoring these algorithms. That's a critical component when you consider that these illegal robocallers are, oftentimes changing the numbers that they're spoofing, every 10 minutes, every hour. So that information sharing is good, and we fully support that type of information sharing. Another area that I would point out that's important information sharing is U.S. Telecom heads what's called the Industry Traceback Group, which is 23 voice providers. These are cable, wireless, wireline, wholesale providers, and we act in a cooperative manner to basically share call information in order to trace back illegal robocalls. Because I do think that type of sharing, that's a form of information sharing, that's crucial because I'm certainly a big believer that when you can trace those calls back to their source and identify who is originating those calls, you are taking those calls out at the root. Okay, you're not trying to swat flies at the consumer end by labeling or blocking an individual call. You're pulling it out at the source, and that type of information sharing is something that I think within industry should be encouraged. It should be supported, and we certainly support broad participation in this type of sharing so that we can more easily identify where these calls are coming from.
Kevin, that was one call not blocked.
Yeah, exactly. Get on that.
Michelle, did you have something to add?
We support the information sharing, obviously, also from the FCC and the FTC. I think that's valuable information, and companies have access to that information, so they actually have the ability to look up their phone numbers to see if they're showing up on that database as a phone number that's that is receiving a complaint. So I think there's huge value in those types of lists, and I again just reiterate the importance of if companies' telephone numbers are being blocked, we just really need a way of knowing that. We need a way of being able to rectify a system where blocking or labeling is happening in a way that isn't appropriate.
Okay. Kevin.
Can I just add one more thing? One other factor that I'd point out that's important, especially how we teed up this conversation about the number of complaints being received by the FCC and FTC. That information sharing also goes from some of these, deployed scoring and labeling services to the FTC's and FCC's complaint mechanism. So in other words, that may be a source of some of the increase in consumer complaints, is that you have consumers who are now empowered with consumer tools, and those tools are reporting to the FTC and providing, what I think is real, timely, accurate information so that, it benefits the broader good, both in terms of enforcement and making existing tools that much more accurate.
And I think,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think consumers are eager to participate in data sharing as well. If you look at sort of you Google a number that shows up on your phone, you can hit 10 different results that are going to tell you what that call was likely to have been and why you shouldn't have answered it. When consumers call our hotlines to report that they've gotten these calls, the constant sort of reprieve is, I want to get this number shut down. I want to, so that this person doesn't harm or scam someone else. So I think there's an eagerness by consumers to participate where it's appropriate and when they can as well.
I guess the only thing I would say, and even just from the former regulator standpoint, when we received complaints, and especially in today's environment where we're hitting an app to send a complaint directly to a regulatory agency, oftentimes the consumer is not aware of who's calling them. They don't know what the content of the call is. So I think that there's a likelihood of many false positives that are happening throughout that complaint process. Having said that, I still think it's valuable information for the companies. If their phone numbers are being reported, they have the ability to look up those numbers, and they know that they are doing something that is not affecting what they want, which is to have a positive consumer or business interaction. So that those types of databases are helpful for that.
Well, the clock says we have a minute left, but I see that our next speaker is already here. So in effort to keep us on time, I think we should probably wrap up there rather than asking another question. So I want to thank you all again for being here today and for offering your perspectives on this issue. I appreciate your time.
Great. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you to Micah and our Panel 1 panelists. Our next featured speaker is FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr.
Well, thanks everyone for taking the time to be here at this important discussion that we're having today, and thank you for the chance to say a few words. As a consumer, I certainly appreciate all the work that industry, consumer groups, federal government, state government is putting into this. My very first meeting as an FCC commissioner was in September of last year, sat right over here. And during the meeting, my phone went off and rang. I forgot to put it on silent. It was, of course, a robocall. My colleagues called me out for it. So I got off to the wrong foot in this new job. But hopefully that won't happen again, and we're taking action to address that stuff. But trying to address this issue of robocalls is a complicated task, technically, under the law. And so that's why it's so great that we're seeing the partnerships today from the FTC, FCC, from industry, consumer groups. It is going to take continued, sustained effort along all these fronts to continue to make progress on these issues. Over the past year at the FCC, for instance, we have finally elevated robocalls to our top enforcement priority. And that's a good thing. Right now, consumers receive perhaps 98 million robocalls per day, or roughly 1,000 robocalls per second. At the FCC, we get about 200,000 complaints about robocalls a year. And obviously not every robocall you get, not every person that gets multiple ones is going to file a complaint at the FCC, so you can extrapolate significantly upwards from that to get a sense of the scope of this problem. So we need to continue to work with all stakeholders to be creative about identifying and implementing solutions and taking aggressive enforcement action. And at the FCC, we're already working on a number of fronts. Reassigned numbers is one of them, as you may have discussed already today. I think the estimates are somewhere around 38 million numbers are reassigned to years. You can give someone permission to call you, but that number is subsequently reassigned to another person. Then they end up getting spammed from callers, even though they didn't give their permission to receive it. We took a vote yesterday to try to move down the path of a reassigned numbers database and explore other ways to solving this one piece of the problem. Spoofing is another issue that I'm sure a lot of you are running into. I get it a lot. You see a phone number, it may reflect the same exchange as your cell phone number. It rings a bell that maybe this is someone you know, you pick it up. That's another issue that we've been taking action on at the FCC. In November of last year, we adopted rules that will give phone companies greater flexibility to block calls that are likely fraudulent due to their originating number. Call authentication is another area that we're working on at the Commission. In July of last year, we launched a proceeding to facilitate methods of authenticating the true source of a phone call. We heard a little bit about that at the last panel, that ultimately that's one great way to get at the root of this problem. You know, right now with IP networks, with phone calls coming in, it can be difficult to fully trace back where the actual call originated from, and that's been stopping some of our enforcement actions. So with industry's efforts, with technological progress, we're continuing to work on that effort as well. Finally, obviously, is the enforcement side. And at the FCC, the last couple months, we've been issuing some of the largest fines in FCC history against illegal robocallings, which will hopefully stop some of the most abusive practices we're seeing and send the right signal to the community that the FCC is very serious, the FTC is serious, state actors are serious about taking aggressive action against those people that are initiating these unwanted robocalls. So there's more work to do, but the FCC, FTC, state and industry partners, we are all committed to taking action. We hear from consumers what a problem this is. We also understand the scope and nature in terms of how difficult it is for us to solve it, but we're committed to moving forward. So I welcome today's event and the additional ideas and areas for action that it is identifying. And with that, I will move off the stage and let the true experts on this continue the really productive discussion. I do look forward to seeing the continued efforts of these types of groups and seeing where at the FCC we can continue to take action to protect consumers. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Our second panel is entitled Recent Regulatory and Enforcement Efforts. It is moderated by Tom Paul, Acting Director of the FTC's Bureau of Consumer Protection. So I invite Tom and the panelists to please come up. And I will turn it over to Tom. Thank you.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Tom Paul. I'm the Acting Director of the FTC's Bureau of Consumer Protection. I'm thrilled to be here today to talk about what we can do to combat unwanted and unlawful robocalls. In our first panel, we heard a lot about the prevalent extent, nature of the unwanted robocalling problem that we have in the United States. I think that was a very appropriate, very great way for us to get started in looking at this issue. And fortunately, our next panel here is going to talk about what state and federal government officials have been doing, what they can do, what they'd like to do to deal with robocall problems. And fortunately, we have a very experienced and esteemed group of panelists today to help walk us through what the government is doing, what challenges the government faces, and what their plans are for the future to try to deal with illegal robocalls. And so maybe I can just go through and have each of our panelists briefly say who they are and where they're from and what organization they represent, and we can start with Christy Thompson.
Hi,
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Christy Thompson. I'm the Division Chief of the Telecommunications Consumers Division, but I like to think of myself as the FCC's Robocall enforcer. That is the subject nearest and dearest to my heart. So I lead a team of about 40 analysts and attorneys. Our number one focus is on consumer protection, and of consumer protection right now, the biggest issue is, of course, stopping illegal robocalls.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Mark Stone. I'm Deputy Chief in the FCC's Consumer Bureau, and I work on robocalls from a policy and rulemaking perspective. And absolutely, illegal robocalls are the FCC's top consumer protection priority, so we're busy.
I'm Sherwin See. I'm Special Counsel in the Policy Division of the Wireline Competition Bureau. And one of the issues that we're working on is call authentication and trust anchors, the shake and stir standards that you've been hearing about.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Lois Greisman. I'm with the Federal Trade Commission. I head what's called the Division of Marketing Practices, which has primary responsibility for enforcement of the telemarketing rules, both where there's fraudulent conduct and abusive conduct. And it's nice to see so many familiar faces, most of whom I think are friendly.
Good morning. My name is Denise Bamer. I'm the Senior Assistant Attorney General from the great state of Florida with the Florida Attorney General's Office. Within that office in the Consumer Protection Division, we are charged with the civil enforcement of the Unfair and Deceptive Trade Practices Act, along with other state and federal consumer-related acts. The Attorney General, Pam Bondi, is deeply committed to fighting illegal robocalls, and there is enough work for our attorneys and our staff and our investigators to keep us busy.
Great. Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists for being here today and sharing their expertise with us. I think some folks have already started doing this, but I would like to have each of our panelists talk about what statute or regulations their organizations enforce or implement. Because one of the things I think is very valuable for people to understand is that there are a number of legal restrictions in place, and try to get a sense of how those various legal regimes interact with one another. So perhaps we could go through each of the panelists again and talk about what their organization enforces or implements in terms of statutes and regulations to get a bit of flavor for what the overall federal and state enforcement and regulatory scheme looks like. And again, we start with Christy.
The hazard of being on the end here. So the FCC has two main provisions of the Communications Act that are relevant for robocalls. And the first one is, of course, the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, the TCPA, which governs pre-recorded and auto-dialed calls and has been the subject of quite a bit of litigation since it was adopted by Congress in 1991. The second very important provision that we enforce is the Truth in Caller ID Act of 2009. And that is the act that says it's unlawful to falsify the caller ID information if the purpose of doing so is to defraud, cause harm, or wrongfully obtain something of value. So those two things dovetail with each other nicely because we see problems with both of those things. There's a huge number of illegal robocalls, of course, and that triggers the TCPA. And the illegal robocallers, the worst of the worst, the ones who are out there trying to defraud consumers, use spoofing as a way to hide from law enforcement, to hide from consumers finding out who they are and exercising their right to pursue legal remedies in court on the consumer level, and hide from our carrier allies that are trying to locate these guys and block them. So the FCC. It's very important for us that we exercise both of those laws to the fullest extent. Those are the tools that we have to take down illegal robocalls, and that's pretty much what I do 24/7 when we're looking at cases that we take. That's our toolbox.
Good. Thank you.
So I also work a lot on the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, more from a rulemaking or policy implementation perspective. And what folks may not know is actually robocall is a term of art under the TCPA and the FCC's rules. And just to say at the beginning, not all robocalls are bad. I think we heard on the last panel there's lots of robocalls that consumers want to get, that have expressed their consent to get. So nevertheless, the TCPA and the Commission's rules define illegal robocalls broadly for landline phones. Those are calls that leave pre-recorded or artificial voice messages and are also telemarketing. For wireless, it's a little bit different. It's calls that leave auto-dialed or pre-recorded voice messages or are made with an auto-dialer. And it doesn't matter if those calls are telemarketing or non-telemarketing. So there's a little bit of distinction between whether the call is to a landline or wireless phone, and it's something that we think a lot about around here. And as Christy mentioned, also we work on the Truth in Caller ID Act, which is a little bit more Sherwin's bailiwick.
Well, I don't think that there's any additional statutes I have to add for the FCC to cover. We can talk about the standards a bit later.
Sure. Thank you.
So from the Federal Trade Commission, we can reach illegal calls under our main act, the Federal Trade Commission Act, but the really discrete set of rules that govern telemarketing are part of the telemarketing sales rule, which was amended effective 2009 to prohibit virtually all robocalls. Unless the consumer has given express written permission to that seller to receive a robocall. Now, and this is a tighter regulatory scheme than the do not call scheme because the consumer doesn't have to be on the National Do Not Call Registry for that robocall to be illegal. But I think a real difference between the FCC's regulatory scheme and the FTC's is really the definition of what is telemarketing. For us, for the Federal Trade Commission, it has to be the sale of a good or product or the solicitation of a donation. Informational calls are not covered. So when Michelle and Kevin gave the example of the school call, the appointment reschedule call, the doctor's office call, those are not telemarketing under the Federal Trade Commission's rules. And I want to make one additional point just on scope of coverage. Calls that use soundboard technology or avatar technology, which we often see used by for-profit telefunders, those soliciting charitable donations on behalf of others. The FTC considers those robocalls, and they are not permitted. Thank you.
So our primary authority comes from the Florida Unfair and Deceptive Trade Practices Act. We also have other Florida state law, like the Florida Telemarketing Act, that we can enforce in court. We also have the ability to enter into federal court and enforce provisions of the TCPA and the TSR, and we have partnered with the Federal Trade Commission to bring actions in federal court and have obtained very successful results.
Great, thank you. Well, clearly from what we heard this morning from Chairman Pai, Acting Chairman Olhausen, and what we've heard about Attorney General Bondi's priorities, certainly dealing with robocalls is at the top of the agenda of many federal and state officials. I'd like to hear from the panelists as to are there any new actions or initiatives your organizations have commenced to deal with unlawful robocalls, including partnerships with each other or partnerships with industry, working with consumer advocates. Are there new actions or initiatives your organizations have undertaken that you'd like to highlight for the folks in attendance?
I'll take a crack at that initially if you want.
Sure.
So we've heard a little bit of talk earlier today about a commission decision back last November. And that was one of the first times the commission has really said the voice service providers are our partners in blocking illegal robocalls. If we can stop the worst robocalls before they ever reach consumers, that's a win. And so in November of last year, the commission for the first time said that voice providers can block calls that are highly likely to be illegal. How do we know they're highly likely to be illegal? Because of the spoofing element that we touched on earlier. So the commission specified 3 categories of spoofed calls where it found no legitimate robocaller would be spoofing these numbers. So we've heard a little bit about this already, but it's a do not originate type of number. Think about the IRS scam where the IRS says, we do not make calls from this number. Any call purporting to be from this number ain't us. And so please block those sorts of calls. The second category are calls with caller ID of invalid phone numbers. Think of a 000 area code. No legitimate caller would want to call from this number. And then finally, there are numbers that may otherwise be legitimate but haven't been allocated or assigned to anyone yet. Again, no reason that a legitimate robocaller would want to make those calls. So again, the Commission in November said that voice providers may, although they don't have to, block these types of calls before they ever reach consumers. And at the same time, the Commission is looking at other objective bases that might be highly likely to indicate that a call is illegal. So these are data analytics types things where, for example, someone spoofs my phone number and all of a sudden a voice provider sees that my number is making 1 million robocalls in the course of a couple of seconds. That's probably not me. Probably a good indication that that's a spoofer. So the Commission is developing a record around that. Of course, one of the issues there is we want to make sure that my ability to make calls, a legitimate subscriber's ability to make calls, is not compromised. So that's a big part of what we're looking at.
So I'm glad you asked that question. Just this morning, we filed a case against a massive robocaller, FTC against Alliance Security, engaged in, not surprisingly, making directly and indirectly millions of robocalls, including calls to consumers whose number is on the Do Not Call registry, and using deceptive tactics to sell home security alarms. I suspect there's not a single person in this room who hasn't received that type of phone call. And I'll give a quick shout out to Ian Barlow, who's one of our lead counsels in it. So this is another case tackling what we really strategically identify as kingpins in the robocalling industry, whether they're the dialers or voice blasters that are hosting these calls and pushing them out, or the main sellers at the top of these affiliate telemarketing networks. We've brought a series of these cases. I could name the names, but hopefully no one in this room is really familiar with them. But they're well known in industry. And our job, our goal has been to strategically target them, identify them, and impose as strong civil injunctive relief as we can. In most of these cases, we've successfully achieved bans, telemarketing bans. In fact, part of this case, some of the defendants settled and they are banned from selling home security alarm systems. And in other instances, trying to achieve as strong a civil penalty amount as we can. One of the defendants in this case paid $300,000. Speaking of partnerships, yes, the state of Florida has been a tremendous partner in really the fraudulent telemarketing cases, which cause enormous economic injury. And we've forged not just state federal partnerships, but also partnerships with our international colleagues who suffer the same impact of these awful telemarketing calls, and with a particular focus on illegal telemarketing out of India.
So one of the things that we are interested in helping along is this industry effort to implement shake it and stir, so call authentication. You've heard a little bit about this, but essentially the idea is that a carrier, a phone company, can sign the phone calls as they're being made. It's a way for the company that initiates the phone call to vouch for it, that this call is actually coming from the number it says it is coming from. So they're able to include that signature on it when it's received. Whoever's receiving that, actually the phone company that's going to terminate that call, or even the handset manufacturer, or even the consumer themselves, can make that decision, can determine what to do with this call, knowing that either they know it is from the number it says it's from, or it can't be vouched for. So that leaves any person along that chain the ability to make those decisions. So the phone companies can block it. A third-party, anti-spoofing organization can block that, or the consumer could, receiving this information, say, "There's no sort of vouching for this. I'm not going to accept this call." It also, in the case where calls are verified, they turn out to be fraudulent, it would allow enforcement to trace back and find those people much more easily than I think the current process allows. So what the FCC is interested in doing is making sure that, so these standards have been developed, where they're being tested right now, and we want to make sure that this process continues to move forward, that it can be deployed broadly and as quickly as possible to help people combat spoofing and illegal spoofing. We have a record that's open on this. The North American Numbering Council is currently consulting on ways to make sure that we can set up the structures necessary for industry to coordinate and collaborate on this and to move this forward as quickly as we can.
So the Florida Attorney General's Office has a special investigations unit where if we get a consumer complaint about a particular phone call, we'll reach out to the carrier, communicate what the consumer has told us via the complaint, and try and have that phone number stopped. However, time is of the essence in these cases. These robocallers are very sophisticated. They change their phone numbers on a very consistent basis, so we've had some success. We also work with other state agencies, and we're constantly in communications about new scams because they're constantly changing, especially those that target veterans, those that target senior citizens within the state and outside, and also other groups that are sensitive and vulnerable to these types of scams.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. One question that had come up on the last panel, or one point that had come up on the last panel, is the difference between unlawful robocalls and lawful robocalls. Just curious as to what your organizations do to try to treat these calls differently and in your work. And perhaps start with Denise.
I think it's easy to differentiate between the fraudulent telemarketing calls and those that are legitimate. The fraudulent telemarketing calls have those consistent red flags. High pressure sales tactic, you have to pay me now, the offer is going to end soon, and then later I couldn't cancel or get a refund, and then I cannot get in contact with whatever good or service was provided over the phone. So it's very easy for our investigators and our staff to differentiate and sort out those that are, really the fraudulent robocalls versus those from legitimate businesses.
And I'd say on our side, I mentioned earlier us empowering, the FCC empowering voice providers to block illegal robocalls. At the same time, call completion of legitimate calls, all legitimate calls, including robocalls, is also important to the FCC. So what we've done is encourage voice providers, you heard a little bit about this earlier, to have a mechanism in place to identify quickly false positives and rectify that situation, because no one wants your kid's school robocall to get blocked in the net. Similarly, you heard mentioned earlier today of a reassigned numbers database. That's an effort by the FCC to make sure that robocalls made by legitimate callers that are desired by consumers are still made and still received. So the mere fact that I give up my phone number to someone else should not mean that I stop getting the robocalls that I consented to earlier, and it shouldn't mean that the new person that has the phone number gets unwanted robocalls. So that's a big part of our initiative, to make sure the good robocalls get to the right people, even as we move forward to block the worst robocalls.
And I just want to underscore from the Federal Trade Commission, the definition of telemarketing is different, so that the school calls, the doctor calls, are not telemarketing, are not robocalls. They're not illegal for purposes of the Federal Trade Commission Act, and I think that really is an important distinction. That's not where we're doing any law enforcement, and nor would we. And the FTC also doesn't distinguish between a call to a wireline or a wireless one. Those are just not relevant distinctions. I think the world of industry robocalls that are legitimate really is a fairly narrow slice, and this is something I've talked to Pace about. And the FTC has no interest whatsoever in chilling that world, but I do think it is a relatively narrow set of the unwanted and illegal robocalls that are being placed.
I think that's right, and that's certainly that tracks with what we see on from the FCC's side as well. To add to this, to the extent that the FCC, the TCPA could potentially draw in more than say the most abusive types of robocalls. We have the prosecutorial discretion, if you will, to decide what kind of cases to take. And me and my enforcement attorneys are not interested in taking cases against school districts that are that may be calling a little more than they should. We don't have the time or resources to police non-problematic robocalls. Mm-hmm. So we really look at what are the consumers telling us are problematic robocalls, and that's where we're going to focus our efforts. So that's the IRS scams, that's the Microsoft scams, the other my favorite are the carpet cleanings and the roofing scams that show up quite frequently. We're going after the worst of the worst because they're the ones that need the most attention immediately.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. What would you say is the most important and most significant challenge your organization faces in dealing with illegal robocalls?
I'll start with this.
Sure.
Spoofing is the gasoline on the robocalling fire. It allows illegal robocalls, to thrive, to spread, and it makes it very, very difficult for me to find the bad guys and take action against them. That is the most significant challenge for us, is going through the process of identifying where those illegal robocalls come from. It's a laborious enforcement process. We have to send a daisy chain of subpoenas from the end recipient's carrier all the way to the originating carrier, because there is no identifier that we can trust in the call stream information. That's changing, which I'm very glad is happening with the Shaken and Stir standards that are being rolled out. And another significant change that has happened just in the last 5 years has been folks like the U.S. Telecom that have gotten together their traceback group and are now working together cooperatively to save me, for example, 5 or 6 steps in the subpoena process. That group of carriers getting together, sharing information, and tracing back the call as far as they can before letting us know and referring it to us means that's numerous carriers in the chain that I don't have to contact or subpoena or try to get information from, because they've already done that work for me. That has been tremendously helpful, and I couldn't be happier at our continued partnership on that front.
I totally agree. What industry has done on traceback has been enormously helpful. And we encounter the exact same challenges FCC does, and I'm sure the states do. We've got a spoofed number. What do you do? How do you work with that? I mean, I think you talk about challenge. So every month we have upwards of 400,000 reports about unwanted calls. I'm not saying every one of those is an illegal call, but one can probably presume that the vast majority are, and that those are the tip of the iceberg of unwanted and illegal calls received each month. Every business day, we're putting on the public record the consumer reports of some 18,000 phone numbers. So that's a lot of information out there. That's a lot of potential targets to work with. So, the challenge in law enforcement in this area, like in so many areas, we all have limited resources. How do you strategically target so that you're getting the biggest bang for the buck? One of the enormous challenges has been telemarketing from abroad, and we see this in the IRS scams and what we call the technical support scams. Hi, I'm from Microsoft, I'm from Dell, your computer's infected. We've met several times in India with Indian authorities, with stakeholders, with industry members, as well as had a series of meetings here, and we've actually been successful in shutting down some of those operations with the Indian authorities, and particularly the Department of Justice here. There was a major crackdown, I think it was back in the fall of 2016. So there are ways to try to combat the illegal telemarketing that's coming from abroad, but I think that will continue to pose a real challenge.
So I think the challenge for us is when we turn our policy lens to one particular type of robocall or spoofing and try to get a beat on that, often the spoofers and robocallers move to other areas. We hear about neighbor spoofing all the time. So that's a big challenge to us. But it's very gratifying to see so many folks in the space kind of come together. I think we've never worked better with industry on trying to solve the problem with our other federal partners as well. There's also a challenge. A big part of what my bureau does is consumer outreach. So it's a big challenge to talk to consumers and say, hey, we're trying to help. We're trying to prevent illegal robocalls, trying to make sure that you can trust eventually, when a phone number pops up on your phone, that's exactly who that is and it's okay to pick that up. Or also educate them if they're unsure about the caller to hang up and then Google the phone number that came in to you to see if it's legitimate or not. So that's a big part of this, is talking to consumers and letting them know kind of what their best method is to protect themselves, even as we on a policy or enforcement side are trying to work at a higher level to make things better in the future.
I would echo everything that the panel has already mentioned about spoofing, the international presence, and the outreach component. There's also the component of locating the actual rooms where the telemarketing calls are coming from. In Central Florida, where I'm in sunny Orlando, but in Central Florida, we have conducted immediate access cases where we enter the telemarketing room once we receive a federal court order, and we actually see the telemarketers set up in the rooms. We see the network systems that have been built in, but finding those actual rooms can become a challenge because they create this web and this maze of shell companies. So from an enforcement point of view, that can be a significant challenge as well.
Great. Thank you. The D.C. Circuit issued a decision last week ruling on a number of objections to a 2015 FCC order clarifying various aspects of the TCPA's general bar against automatic dialing devices to make uninvited calls. I was wondering if some of our colleagues from the FCC could briefly describe what the D.C. Circuit held, and if the panelists could speak to whether that decision is likely to have an impact on the government's ability to deal with unwanted robocalls or not.
Sure. I would say we're still digesting the opinion here. It was somewhat complex, but at a high level, the court ruled on a couple of things. The FCC's interpretation of the term auto dialer, which is relevant to robocalls made to wireless phones, as I mentioned earlier. Also, the FCC's past interpretation of a reassigned numbers issue, and then finally revocation of consent, and there was one other issue as well. So the D.C. Circuit said the past FCC's decision or interpretation of auto dialer was flawed. So that was kind of the big headline from the decision. Secondly, the D.C. Circuit reversed the past commission's decision on reassigned numbers, including a one-call safe harbor where a caller the past commission said that the caller had one call to find out that a number's been reassigned, and after that they're on the hook for liability. So the D.C. Circuit set that aside. And then generally upheld the past commission's decision on revocation of consent, finding that consumers have a right to revoke past consent. So again, we're digesting that decision. It's somewhat complex. I think our view here is a lot of the initiatives that we've taken at the FCC aren't really dependent on any specific TCPA decision or interpretation. For example, I think the court noted favorably the reassigned numbers initiative that was voted on yesterday. Likewise, caller ID authentication and call blocking really don't depend on any specific TCPA interpretation. So I would expect, as the Commission's digesting the decision and thinking about next steps, these other efforts to protect consumers will proceed.
And on the enforcement side, the largest couple of cases that we have released in the past year have been at least the notices of apparent liability that actually proposed fines were based on the Truth in Caller ID Act, not on the TCPA, which was the focus of the court's action in its most recent decision. So in terms of putting folks like Adrian Abramovich out of business, the court's decision doesn't really affect our work to enforce the spoofing laws. And even the court's decision on, we also cited Abramovich for violating the TCPA for making illegal robocalls. But those robocalls included a pre-recorded voice message. And so under the TCPA, the auto dialer issue that was the key focus of the ACA decision doesn't really enter into that. So we feel confident that we will continue to bring cases against the Adrian Abramoviches of the world, especially when those mass spoofers the mass robocallers are engaging in spoofing, which violates a completely separate statute. And so you'll see more from us even after this ACA decision.
Great, thank you. Start turning to some of the possible solutions to overcoming the challenges that folks on the panel have mentioned. Would changes in the law, whether that's statute or regulation, be helpful to you in your efforts to try to deal with unlawful robocalls? And I'd be interested in hearing from any of the panelists as to whether they think there are changes in statute or regulation that could be helpful, and if so, how could they be helpful?
So the FTC's been on record, I think now, Tom, for more than a decade, for a repeal of the common carrier exemption. It's obsolete. It just doesn't make sense in this day and age. It actually hasn't made sense for the last decade or more. It does impede or at least hinder our ability to go after some bad actors out there, particularly in the reselling market, where we do see specific carriers that in effect are hosting robocallers that are placing illegal calls. We also encounter instances in our law enforcement work where we see entities that are going to, if they're not actual carriers, they'll purport to be carriers, so it just raises our enforcement costs in going after them. So that's the big one from us.
Mm-hmm.
The FCC has also been on record for a couple of improvements that would help in terms of enforcement. One is extending, we have a 1-year statute of limitations, so extending the statute of limitations, for example, to 2 years instead of 1 would be enormously helpful. Previously, I talked about the difficulty in finding the bad guys when they use spoofed numbers, and pretty much all of the bad guys use spoofed numbers. That just slows down our ability to find them, which means, from a practical perspective, several months may go by, even if we're notified of the robocall, the day after it happens. It will take us some amount of time to figure out where that call came from and identify, untangle the shell, like the nest of shell companies, like Lois mentioned, and that eats into that 1-year statute of limitations. It seems like a long time, but from an enforcement perspective, it really isn't. The other change that we have talked about publicly is under the TCPA and under the Communications Act. When we find a robocaller, and this is just for the robocall violations of the TCPA, if that violator is not a authorization holder, a permit, or license holder of the FCC, the maximum enforcement action that we can take against that robocaller is to send them a citation, which is effectively a legal warning letter. Don't do this in the future or you'll get in trouble. The purpose for that, as enacted by Congress, was to make sure that folks who aren't necessarily well versed in FCC law don't get swept up into the some more nuanced portions of the Communications Act, which makes sense. But at this point, it's so well known that robocalls are a problem, and the targets that we are going after are so clearly and obviously intentionally violating the law that having a warning letter at the outset is really frustrating, and it would be helpful to exempt, as Congress did in the spoofing context, to exempt that part of the Communications Act from the citation requirement.
Thank you. One thing that folks have noticed is that many of the bad actors and their assets are located abroad. What are the sort of things that are impediments to proceeding against foreign-based actors, and are there things that can be done to overcome those obstacles? And maybe you can ask Lois to respond to that first.
Well, we have, through Safe Web Act, the FTC does have lots of tools that it can use to seek to obtain information on entities located offshore. So we can issue process and do parts of an investigation. Obviously, where there are assets offshore, that gets incredibly complicated. Mm-hmm. We tend, though, to see even the Indian telemarketing operations that are targeting U.S. citizens and Canadians and others. We will often see something in the U.S., something that we can freeze as part of a federal district court proceeding. And in some instances, we have defendants who, for a variety of reasons, are actually willing to repatriate assets that are located offshore. So we've had a fair amount of success, but there's no question this is a challenging area.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of shaken and stir, it should actually be possible if two countries have these systems in place and they can coordinate their systems appropriately. These systems should be able to work across borders, so it would be possible to have international calls be vouched as well. It does require more coordination, and that's something that we hope to see in the future.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah, it has been it's very challenging when you identify a bad guy robocaller and determine that they are operating overseas. I don't think it's any secret there are some countries that we have great relationships with. In terms of the United States has a great back and forth and a cooperative relationship for law enforcement purposes, and there are other countries for whom that is not at all the case. And so we have been frustrated before tracing back calls to locations and countries that have a difficult or even overtly hostile relationship with the United States, because there's practically speaking very little chance that we are going to be able to persuade the lawmakers or authorities in those jurisdictions to go after their citizens and help us in those investigations. So that becomes frustrating, but that's where cooperation with the FTC and other elements of the federal, of the United States federal government, State Department, other law enforcement agencies, becomes extremely vital to have that communication back and forth.
I want to draw an imperfect line, and my colleagues from the FTC will, I'm sure, correct me if I'm wrong. Much of what I would call the abusive telemarketing, where they're selling home alarm systems, medical alert devices, some energy, solar panels, I think most of that is emanating from the United States. That what we're seeing often, and the kingpin telemarketer, robocaller, might have a call center in the Philippines and Nicaragua, somewhere else, but the core of that operation, the abusive telemarketing operation, is in the United States, where we see the significant international issues posed is really where we're seeing hardcore fraudulent telemarketing.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question. We heard a lot on the first panel about what industry is doing. I'd like to hear from each of the panelists as to what's the most important thing that industry does to help you do your job, and what could industry do different or better to help you protect consumers from illegal robocalls? And maybe we can start at this end with Denise this time.
I think the most helpful information from private industry is helping us locate the originating phone calls and to not allow those massive robocalls to keep going through the carrier system. But obviously the subpoena responses that we obtain from the companies assists us in our investigation. I think more outreach and education to the consumers that there are different apps available. There, certain things to avoid when you get these robocalls would be helpful, especially to those with that are senior citizens. We see that. Especially in the state of Florida, where we have a great consumer population of senior citizens, they are not aware of the technology that is available. They're more trusting of people that call on the phone and speak to them. They're more likely to send money for the scams, and they don't want to be rude and hang up the phone when they probably should. So more outreach and informing consumers and their family members that those tools are out there and available would greatly assist us from our enforcement side.
Mm-hmm. One word: innovate. Do what you do best. It is just remarkable to see the proliferation and variety of call blocking technologies that have developed over the last several years. And sitting from the FTC, we're really proud of the role we played spurring these technological developments, starting in the 2012 first Robocall challenge. When I'm looking at some people who've visited recently, it's wonderful to come in and tell us what you're doing, tell us how we can assist. The dynamic shift in the marketplace from just a few years ago when it was like call blocking is illegal, we can't do it, there's just, don't even say the words, to now concerns with perhaps the unintended consequences of too much call blocking. I mean, that is a dynamic marketplace, and that's exactly what we want to see happening.
So I think the call authentication standards are industry developed, and I think that's one of the great things that's been happening in this field. As for what can be done, I think it really is a matter of they've been developed, they're being tested. It's a matter of them being deployed as fully and as quickly as we can get them out there. So making sure that industry is working together with each other and coordinating properly to bring that out, that these systems are going to be out there and usable to a wide variety of actors.
So I think for us, it's call blocking. We've worked very well with industry, I think the telecom industry, to encourage call blocking on objective bases. So making sure that call blocking isn't sort of arbitrary, that it's based on good objective criteria. At the same time, the FCC, as I mentioned before, made call blocking optional. It's voluntary. And so I think one thing that we're interested in hearing is what is difficult about call blocking for some carriers. Is it a cost issue? Is it other issues? I think we'd like to see more carriers block based on the grounds that we've said you can block on. And so I think that's a big part of our work, is to determine how carriers view that and what may be some of the struggles they're facing as they implement blocking.
And from my perspective as from on the enforcement side, the best thing that the carriers and industry have done for us in the last few years is and can continue to do is work with us, continue to share information with us, continue to think of new ways to combat an ever evolving landscape of illegal activity. The fraudsters that we are up against are creative. They're highly skilled, and they're very adaptive. When you close off one way that they get in, they will explore and expand into another way. And so that presents a challenge that will require law enforcement and industry and consumer groups all to work together. In this space, there's not one of those individual pieces that has all of the answers or has the ability to control the whole ecosystem and stop it. It really requires every consumers and government and industry all working together to solve the problem and to keep talking to each other about the new issues that are coming up when they come up, so that we can tackle them immediately.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. One thing that has been mentioned a number of times on the panel is the value of partnerships, whether that's federal, state, among government officials. I wonder if you could talk about, are there things that governmental partners could do better or differently in the future to be more effective?
So speaking for us, I think we've developed a great relationship with the Federal Trade Commission. I think in my shop we do a lot of rulemaking, and the FTC's been instrumental in offering great comments on how we might move forward. I think also doing outreach together is a really good idea. I think this is part of that. I think the FTC's got terrific outreach materials. We do as well. And I think making sure that consumers understand, we're one federal government working for them would be great. A lot of times we get questions around, well, do I file a complaint with the FTC or FCC? So I think that's an opportunity for us to continue to work together and improve that.
I think we do a pretty good job at it. I appreciate what Mark says and other panelists here, but we've been working cooperatively with the FCC on this issue for however long. State partners have been tremendous, not just Florida, but we work through NAG. There are, I think, monthly calls on what's happening on the telemarketing front. And it's a target-rich environment, so we all need to be at the table. We are all at the table.
Working with the Federal Trade Commission has been a wonderful experience. Going into federal court, getting the ex parte injunction, the asset freezes, having the receiver take over the business, and try and get restitution for consumers. We as a state, we are on the grounds. We are the boots on the grounds that can conduct the surveillance and look into the maze of shell companies and also the bank accounts that exist, and trying to track down that money so we can seize it and ultimately get it to the consumers and provide injunctive relief like a lifelong telemarketing ban or a ban against making deceptive and misrepresentations when it comes to selling goods and services over the telephone. So I think the partnership with the Federal Trade Commission has been great. We're also in communication with the Federal Communications Commission because their targets, some of them are located in Florida, so we're constantly in communication with our federal partners. We also work with our different state regulators. In Florida, we have the licensing arm of the telemarketing statute, which is the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. So we're constantly working with them to stop the robocalls, and also, as Lois mentioned, the NAGTRI, where we're constantly sharing information with Canada and other foreign countries, federal partners, and also various states.
One question that comes up anytime we're talking about consumer protection law is how we could work better with consumer advocates and other nonprofit organizations, non-governmental organizations, and the like. What is their role in dealing with unwanted robocalls, unlawful robocalls, and are there things that we could do better working with them to help consumers? Throw that out for any of the panelists to respond to.
So I see Susan Grant here and Margot Saunders, and I'm sure they will have their own views, but I view them as enormous resources. You know, if I have questions about what's going on, I ask them if there's some particular, push I'd like them to assist with. I will readily turn to them, and I hope, and it's been my experience, that they'll do the same with us. They have an ability to reach people and through pipelines that we don't, and we rely on them to do just that.
No, I would echo that. We rely tremendously on consumer groups to help us. A lot of our proceedings are paper proceedings, and so we really depend on their submissions, both on legal and policy questions. But in addition to informing our policy and law, it's really important that they're sort of helpful in the outreach perspective, that they help us get the word out on what we're doing, but that we also are able to hear from them what consumers are experiencing every day. So they're invaluable.
Mm-hmm. Consumer complaints drive what I do every day. I look, we look at what consumers are talking about and what the problems they face. They file complaints with us. They file complaints with the FTC. We don't believe in enforcing solutions for which there are no problems. We go after what consumers tell us we need to go after. Right now, that's robocalls. What we hope to get the most out of consumer groups and out of consumers themselves is information, actionable intelligence, actionable intel, something that we can, enough information that can start an investigation to solve that problem, find that bad guy that's making hundreds of millions of illegal robocalls. And our work with consumer advocacy groups has been very helpful. We've been able to explain, this is what we need in consumer complaints in order, for us to pick it up and start the process. It has been great how receptive consumer groups have been, and also, working with folks who offer consumer solutions to the problems also have feedback for us. Folks like Nomo Robo and others they have interface daily with consumers and their users, and they can say, hey, these are the patterns that we're seeing. Those conversations help inform our enforcement efforts and make my job significantly easier.
Thank you. I guess we've got about 10 minutes left, so I think I want to pose one last question and let people elaborate on that. And the question is just, if each panelist could identify what is the most important thing they think that the government could do to decrease the prevalence of unwanted or unlawful robocalls. And perhaps we'll start with Denise this time and just hear from the panelists, what's the most important thing we can do to decrease unwanted and unlawful robocalls going forward?
I think it's going after the kingpins of these industries that are very well known. They're connectors. They connect the different businesses to each other. They are very sophisticated and constantly have scams that are evolving. So really targeting those individuals and going against them with the full force of the law that we can with the tools that we are provided and what remedies were provided under the law, it causes a deterrent effect. I remember we went into a medical, they were selling robocalls. It was a medical alert device system. They were calling nursing homes and other senior citizens with this robocall that said, hey, this is John from shipping. A family member or a friend recommended you get this device. It's similar to a Life Alert device. It's not Life Alert. It was someone else. And so the consumer thought, oh my gosh, my family member thinks I need this. It's free, as the robocall said. Let me just give them the information. Well, lo and behold, we found out that the consumer was charged a monthly fee. They were never told of it, and when they tried to cancel, they couldn't. But when we went into the room and we saw the large telemarketing room with individuals on the phone with sophisticated dialing systems at their computer and their fingertips, and we heard from the business owners that their marketing costs for these robocalls were so cheap that it really, there was no incentive to stop. But when we went in with our receiver and with the attorneys from the Federal Trade Commission in our office, along with Ag Law, which is our criminal, they're with the Department of Agriculture Consumer Services. They have criminal powers, but they came in with us, and we showed them that we were very serious about stopping this. And a lot of those telemarketers later told us that they didn't realize that what they were doing was wrong because they were told something else from their bosses. So I think it really causes a deterrent effect when we go into these businesses and we seize the personal assets and the business assets, and later get a federal court order banning them from the industry, and later it goes out into the internet, and these people can never find jobs. Well, they're not permitted under the order, but some will go out in the industry because that's all they know, but they are now tagged with our law enforcement efforts, and they cannot find a job in the industry. So from top to bottom, I think really being aggressive with these robocallers and working with our partners and really taking a stand does cause a deterrent effect, and I've seen it firsthand.
So 3 prongs. One is sustained, relentless law enforcement, and I want to tease that out a bit when we're talking about abusive telemarketing, not the fraudulent. So the Dish Network case was filed in 2009. It took years to get a litigated decision and the precedent-setting $280 million civil penalty. I say all this with the caveat it's on appeal. But the nature of the telemarketing setup there, the network, and essentially you had a seller saying, I'm not responsible for how my product is marketed or how my product is telemarketed. And this is what we hear time and time again when we're looking at abusive telemarketing. You have the dialer who says, I don't know who's using my platform. How can I possibly know? Well, it's actually very easy to know. Or you have the reseller, unwanted call. It's not me. And if it's a home warranty, if it's a vacation, whatever. You have the affiliate, you have the person who's just doing the robocall that says press 1 if you want a home warranty, saying I don't know what I'm carrying on that. I don't know what the mechanism is. So on law enforcement, part of our job at the FTC is to push the case law, to develop more cases like Dish. I think the case you're referring to is LifeWatch. Again, the same type of affiliate telemarketing network where you have the seller saying, I'm not responsible for how my product is marketed. So moving the case law so that there's greater clarity and greater deterrence is a top priority from where I sit. The other 2 areas are, I'll say it again, innovation, spurring technology, ensuring the marketplace is free to develop the tools that are needed. Third prong is always outreach and consumer education. You'll hear from Nat Wood on the next panel. The materials we put out, I think, are first rate, and we partner with FCC, we partner with the states. The message is not just hang up if you don't recognize. The message is also, here's information on all the great call blocking tools out there. Here are other things you can do to protect your privacy. Thanks.
I've been here talking about spoofing and efforts to combat spoofing, so forgive me. You feel free to accuse me of tunnel vision when I say that I think that that's one of the most important efforts. It does address some of the most egregious types of fraud, and it also just provides more information into the whole system that allows carriers, third-party developers, handset manufacturers, app developers, and consumers themselves to deal with these problems firsthand.
So I agree with Sherwin. I think the biggest thing is call authentication. In the interim, we can facilitate call blocking. We can also do greater enforcement. But in the end, spoofing is the big part of the problem. Indeed, third-party blocking apps and devices are somewhat dependent on spoofing. Not all of them, but spoofing is a way to evade some of that. So it's longer term, but it strikes me that call ID authentication is really where everyone should be focused.
Yeah, and I would echo the same thing. Sherwin, if you're in a tunnel, I'm in there with you, because I 100% agree. Rolling out call authentication is, I think, going to make the biggest difference in the government's ability to stamp out illegal, abusive robocalling, and also the ability of the carriers to exercise, to aid their customers in blocking those calls that their customers also do not want. That is the biggest piece. And then the second piece is that in the meantime, as Mark was alluding to, in the meantime, it's incumbent on all of us to continue to work together and bring the expertise and the resources that each one of us has, consumers, government, and industry together, to combat the problem while the technological upgrades are being completed.
Great. Thank you very much. I think we are out of time. I want to thank all of our panelists for sharing their insights and information about all the fabulous work they're trying to do to deal with illegal robocalls. And thank you very much.
Thank you again, Tom, and all of our Panel 2 panelists. Our next featured speaker is FTC Commissioner Terrell McSweeney. Commissioner McSweeney.
Oh, what a polite audience. Thank you guys very much. I want to say, first of all, good morning, and what a pleasure it is to be here this morning. Thank you to the FCC for hosting this discussion, and thanks very much to all of the Federal Trade Commission staff who have been working tirelessly on this issue for a number of years. It's been a pleasure getting to know them while I've been at the FTC, and they really, I think, as you can see from the discussion on the last panel, working collaboratively with the FCC, with state partners, to fight the scourge of robocalls with the tools that they have. So I want to commend them for their efforts. I'm going to start with the usual disclaimer that I'm giving you my own views, not the official views of the FTC. But I think it is the official view of the FTC that robocalls are our top consumer complaint year over year, and that we need to be using all of our tools in our toolbox to combat the problem. I want to start just by noting, though, that the origins of some of our authorities in this area, privacy, and more specifically, Americans' rights to and control over their data is once again in the news. And it bears noting that the origin of the Do Not Call registry stemmed from a bipartisan effort to protect Americans' privacy in 2003 and unanimously passed the Senate. And at the time, Democrats and Republicans came together to provide a way for people to protect themselves from unwanted intrusion of telemarketing calls. Now, I recognize that we're here today because technology and scammers find ways around those protections, and more on that in a minute. But I don't think that makes the achievement of providing consumers with stronger protections any less notable. And if anything, the news and events of the last week underscore that American consumers deserve stronger protections for their data. The technology we are all using in our daily lives is increasingly sophisticated, and the amount of data we're sharing is increasingly intimate. Without proper protections, our own data can be, and potentially is being, used against us. The incentives in the marketplace drive towards ever greater collection and use of the data. And the FCC, the FTC, and other expert consumer protection regulators all have a role to play in providing protections for consumers. But without a stronger and more resilient framework, one that includes requiring opt-in choices for the monetization of sensitive information, American consumers are going to be left vulnerable at a time when we can least afford to be. think American consumers need stronger protections for the digital age, and those would include comprehensive data security and privacy laws, transparency and accountability for data brokers, and rights to and control over our data. It's time for Democrats and Republicans to come together again to make progress on a significant privacy issue, just like they did 15 years ago. So I'm happy to be here today to say that I think it's very encouraging to hear how the FCC, and our state partners are engaged in unrelenting enforcement efforts to shut down law violators that continue to flood our phones with illegal calls. Here we can all agree that having as many law enforcement partners on the beat as possible to safeguard consumer privacy and protect consumers from fraud and abuse is a no-brainer. As we just heard, multiple enforcement partners leverage different expertise, different jurisdictional authority, and different resources to combat this threat. And I'm particularly proud of the enforcement action the FTC announced today against a home security installation company, Alliance Security, and its telemarketers. According to our complaint, the Alliance defendants made at least 2 million illegal calls to consumers. Violating the law is no way to sell security. But as we know, even with many cops on the beat, the calls keep coming. Consumers need effective tools to stop the seemingly endless calls, and they need meaningful choices to select the best tool for them. The good news is that today there are a growing number of call blocking tools and choices. When I first came to the Commission in 2014, consumers had very few options to stop unwanted calls. But as a result of the Federal Trade Commission's first Robocall challenge, NOMO Robo was available for voice over IP home phones, which is a good start. But there are also very few options for wireless and little to no options being offered directly by the providers. After 3 more FTC challenges and continuous work with the industry and all of our partners, today the landscape is very different. A number of providers offer some types of call blocking services directly to their voice over IP or wireless customers or both, and wireless customers now have a number of call blocking apps to choose from. CTIA, who we'll hear from on the next panel, put out a list of over 40 apps for iOS and Android phones alone. So why aren't these tools having a greater impact, and what can we do to help? Well, first off, many consumers don't know that there are more tools available today to stop illegal or unwanted calls. We're working to change that with today's event, the upcoming expo next month, and through our consumer education. And I'm delighted that the FTC today is putting out additional consumer education materials through our Office of Consumer and Business Education. Second, these tools aren't available to all consumers. Not all providers offer call blocking solutions to their customers. Why not? When consumers pay for phone service, shouldn't they be able to expect that they are getting the best available protection from illegal calls? And finally, consumers with traditional copper landlines still have very few options to stop illegal calls. There's no app for that. The best way to fill these gaps, and what I'm excited to hear more about from the next panel, is to empower and expect providers to deploy solutions at the network level that will reach every consumer. Effective call blocking tools should be available to all consumers. And of course, trust must be restored to caller ID information through adoption of the STIR/SHAKEN framework for caller ID authentication sooner rather than later. I know that the FTC stands ready to do our part and make sure that consumers understand these tools and how best to use them to protect themselves. And with that, I'm excited to turn it over to the next panel for a discussion of the solutions and tools that are available to consumers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner McSweeney. As Commissioner McSweeney said, our third panel is entitled Solutions and Tools for Consumers. It is being moderated by Julie Knapp, who is Chief of the FCC's Office of Engineering and Technology. So I invite Julie to come up and all of the panelists to come up as well. Okay, and I'll turn it over to Julie.
Just give everybody a minute to get settled. So good morning. Still morning. A lot of pressure on this panel because it's the last panel before lunch. So this panel is going to talk about some of the solutions. I know in my home, when the phone rings, the first thing we do is we listen for the announcement of the ID. I get a lot of calls from unavailable and out of area. And then when there's a number that you see perhaps in New York where you might have relatives and you wonder, you don't recognize the number, should I pick it up? Maybe it's somebody calling about something's happened with my brother or sister. Do I take a chance in not answering it? So you go ahead sometimes, and I know my wife will immediately say to me, why did you pick that up? So, this panel is going to talk about some solutions, and so the pressure is on for me. If I don't have something good to say when I get home, I might not get in the door. So obviously there's a lot of terrific work that's going on. And just to start, I'd like to have each of our panelists introduce themselves and say a little bit about their organizations. And we'll start with Alex.
Great, thank you. My name is Alex Algard. I'm here from Hiya. I'm the CEO of the company. We're a Seattle-based business. And one of the business lines is to help our partners, primarily wireless carriers and smartphone OEMs, deal with this Robocall plague. And we also have apps that we provide for direct download by consumers, but that's not as a significant part of our business. We have the largest team in the industry of data scientists and engineers that are dedicated to determining who are the bad callers, who are the good callers, which is equally important, and provide as much information at the fingertips of our user base so they can make informed decisions.
I'm Jim McEachran. I'm here with ATIS, the Alliance for Telecommunications Industry Solutions, and here in the context that Shaken, which is going to be discussed, I think, a little bit today, came from the IPNI task force, which was a joint effort between ATIS and the SIP Forum. And I've personally been fortunate enough to have been involved in that activity since the very beginning when we decided it had to be called Shaken because it wasn't Stir. So.
Hi, I'm Alex Polici. I'm the CEO of Umail. We provide a call blocking app for mobile phones. And we also supply the Umail Robocall Index, which is our estimate of what the world looks like in terms of robocalls every month. We've got some traction in terms of having blocked well over 1 billion calls at this point.
Hi, I'm Margot Saunders. I work with the National Consumer Law Center. We're a national public interest law firm that represents consumers before Congress and the federal agencies.
Great. Thanks.
Hey everyone, I'm Krista Witnowski and I'm AVP at CTIA. We represent the wireless industry from the carriers to the manufacturers. We've been working on fighting illegal robocalls for some time. We were significantly involved with the industry robocall strike force. We helped draft that report, and after the strike force ended, we took on the work and developed a CTIA robocall working group that meets every week. We are continually working on robocall abatement solutions. We're also a member of the FCC's Nancy Call Authentication Working Group, and we're working really hard right now on getting the governance structure for call authentication up and running so we can onboard all the industry to fight that. And we're also a member of the FCC's Consumer Advisory Committee, who's made, as Ed Bartholomew had mentioned in the first panel, many recommendations on call blocking and call authentication during the last year. I'm really looking forward to talking about all the great tools that our own carrier members are doing and the wonderful app ecosystem that's out there represented today by the two Alexes on the panel. Really excited to hear about it. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Nat Wood from the Federal Trade Commission, where I lead the Division of Consumer and Business Education. It's our responsibility for letting regular people understand how to have better experiences as consumers, and to help businesses comply with consumer protection law and also be protected in the marketplace.
So to kick it off, talk a little bit about how consumers protect themselves against robocalls. And I thought maybe we'd just start a little bit on the government side, and then we'll thread that in also as we're having our discussions. So it is a privilege and an honor to be working so closely with FTC. Terrific things happen, I think, when across government agencies work together. So and this is a tough problem, and I think we're all pulling together to solve it. There is some terrific information online at the FCC website. We've got some pamphlets in the back. And for those of you who are watching over the web, if you want to check it out, it's the web address www.fcc.gov/robocalls. There is a lot of terrific information on there about what you can do as a consumer and the resources that are available. And I'll just turn it over to Nat, talk a little bit about what FTC has been doing.
Yeah, so what I would tell somebody who's frustrated by unwanted calls is that there are lots of great resources. I'm excited about this panel to hear more about the tools that industry is coming out with and where we're headed with call authentication. A few years ago, it wasn't so easy to give this advice, but the services are really effective now and becoming more so all the time. We've put out some information today, and for people that are in the room, you can get this on the table. For people online, you can go to ftc.gov/calls. The first thing you want to think about if you want to take advantage of call blocking technology right now is what kind of a phone you're using. So if you have a mobile phone, you may want to download an app. Some are free, some are provided through the carrier services. And see, the second thing you can do is see if there's built-in features from your phone. If you have a landline, you may need to buy a device, and there are some that use blacklists or whitelists to limit the calls and make sure that only calls you want are getting through. And if you have internet phone, and many people it's not that easy to tell, you check with your carrier. So it's a lot of the same sort of advice that we give for people that have a mobile phone. There might be blocking services that either stop the calls or have the information show up about whether it's possibly a scam call or a telemarketer, or possibly put those messages straight through to voicemail. So I hope you'll check those resources out. The Do Not Call registry still has some value, especially in signaling. It's not necessarily going to stop a lot of illegal robocalls, but you know that if you're on the National Do Not Call registry and you get a call from somebody attempting to sell you something, that they're not respecting the registry. And if they're not respecting that law, you probably don't want to do business with them. If you get any sort of unwanted robocall, definitely hang up. There's no reason to stay on the line. And keeping yourself informed about the scams that are out there is always a good idea. So one of the ways that you can do that is to go to ftc.gov/scams and sign up for scam alerts straight to your email box.
Anyone else? Margaret, did you want to say something?
The Telephone Consumer Protection Act not only provides the tools for public enforcement, government enforcement against robocallers, but it also provides the ability of consumers to hire an attorney and bring an action against robocallers themselves. And that's a very valuable tool that people should know about, that they can go into court and get $500 for every illegal robocall that they received.
Mm-hmm. I'd be rich. So let's hear a little bit. I know there's a lot of activity that's been going on across industry in trying to develop solutions to prevent the calls from getting through, the illegal calls from getting through in the first place. So if we could hear a little bit from the service providers and what they are doing, and Jim, maybe I'll start with you.
Thanks. So like Sherwin, I have a little bit of tunnel vision around Shaken, but I want to just step back and put that into perspective. It's not the first thing that the service providers have done. In a sense, basic caller ID is a tool for identifying fraud or robocalls calls you don't want to receive. Whitelist, blacklist built on that, anonymous call rejection, a number of services over the years. Of course, effective or easy spoofing undermined the effectiveness of those, as we all see. And that led to the apps, either internal ones, as a few service providers have internal developed apps, and of course the third-party ones that are represented here today. Those help, but again, spoofing makes it harder for them to do their job, and that's where shaking comes in, not as a solution. That's an important thing, is that shaken by itself is not a solution. It's an enabling technology that provides reliable information into these apps and can make them fundamentally more effective in the long term, and also help with the enforcement initiatives through the ability that it puts to trace the calls back to the origin in a reliable and reliable way. So it's a key enabler, is a key thing, but in a long context.
Can I just follow up? Could you say a little bit, is this something the consumer needs to do with their provider? And can you say a little bit more about what shaken is, if you're explaining it to a layperson?
You asked a rather long question, but yes. So at its core, shaken allows the originating service provider to sign the call and basically to attest to what they know. And that's one of the key things. All calls that are signed are not the same. If the service provider knows that that's your number, then they can sign, this is your number. If they don't know it's your number, but they know who originated it, this is my customer, I know who they are, I know how to find them if they do something bad, you can do a lower level, a partial attestation that says, this is somewhat reliable. And then you have the ones where it's a gateway coming in from who knows where. I don't have any idea, but I know where it entered my network, which might be very useful both for call blocking and analytics engines, but also for tracing. And then the other thing, and then at the receiving end, that information is verified. It's cryptographically signed, cryptographically verified, so that you can't mess with it in between. And the other key thing is that when that is signed, the service provider attaches a unique origination ID, which is just an opaque string that can be used again in traceback, that allows you to identify when you go back to follow up that, yes, I now know exactly where that came from, not just the service provider. And so it just cryptographically provides more information about the call, primarily to assist the analytics engines, who then add that into the mix of what they already do.
To help stem the tide.
Precisely.
Good. Krista, maybe you can talk a little bit on the wireless side.
Sure. So since Jim focused on call authentication and traceback, which are very important initiatives that we're all involved in, I'm going to focus on the tools that our wireless carriers have in place now that are not dependent on a customer necessarily downloading an app. And then I'll get a little bit into the app ecosystem, which has exploded over the last couple of years. So just a few examples. AT&T, to start, they launched a product called AT&T Call Protect. That was back in December 2016. It's a free network service. It allows customers that have iPhones and HD voice-enabled Android handsets to automatically block suspected fraudulent calls. It flags suspected spam calls, so the customer can then choose whether to answer it or not. And using an interface provided by the AT&T Call Protect app, they also have an app, customers can manually block an unlimited number of specific telephone numbers for 30-day intervals. You can download the app across the app ecosystem app stores or on the AT&T website. AT&T on the wireline side also made Call Protect available to its IP wireline home phone users. And Alex from Haya will talk about this, but they have partnered with Haya on this initiative. And through this initiative, they've blocked to date 3.5 billion unwanted robocalls. Sprint offers a service as well, premium caller ID service. This is on a subscription basis. It includes for Android smartphones the ability not only to identify a higher percentage of these nuisance calls, but it's also an option to block them as well. And they work with a company called Sequent. T-Mobile launched a product called Scam ID, and this was last year at this time, March 2017. This is automatic, network-based. It's free for postpaid T-Mobile customers and Metro PCS customers. It identifies calls from known scammers across all handset platforms on smartphones and feature phones. If a scam call is detected, the caller ID is going to display something called scam likely on the device. This gives the customers the option to answer or permanently block the number. There's another product called Scam Block that customers can choose to use. It's also free, and that service will allow calls from known scammers blocked. T-Mobile's working with a company called Privacy Star, who also has an app in the app marketplace. They have blocked more than 3 billion scam calls tagged since the launch of the product. And Verizon, right now, they are currently trialing a free robocall labeling solution. It's called Spam Alerts, and this is for all wireline customers with call ID, and this includes copper customers and Fios digital voice customers, which is great. The feature is warning customers about robocalls, and they also it's available to their entire wireline customer base, and a more robust version with thousands of additional numbers is going to be in production in the next month. They've also worked with the company that you all know, Nomorobo, to develop a one-click solution that simplifies Fios digital voice customers' ability to sign up for that third-party blocking service. And on the wireless side, they offer all customers who subscribe to its caller name ID service a feature at no additional charge that identifies the spam calls and displays the level of risk with a risk meter. They are working with a company called Sequent. Now, besides all those tools that our carriers are in play today, the app ecosystem has exploded in the last 2 years. In 2016, we studied across the board iOS, Android, Windows, and BlackBerry. And at that time, there were a lot of apps. There were over 85 call blocking or labeling apps available. But we have recently went through and looked at it again, and now there are 550 call blocking or labeling apps available. That is a 495% increase in those apps since we launched our website dedicated to educating consumers on this issue. So I think the marketplace is working with the amount of tools. We still need to work. We need to finish up our work on call authentication. That is key. But I think for now, consumers have something to work with until we do finish that.
So I want to hear a little bit about the third-party
Yes.
providers, and then I want to ask some questions on the consumer side and also what Margot into with her thoughts on the reactions to some of this.
Right.
So Alex, maybe if you could talk a little bit about what you've been doing and what your products are.
Sure. So again, our company is called Haya, and we have apps that users can download directly onto either iPhone or Android. As Krista said, there's a lot of choice for consumers. There's over 500 apps, I think you shared, which is pretty astounding. And I think the app stores are pretty effective in guiding consumers to which are the more effective versus the less effective apps. So I'm not so concerned about that. I'm a little bit concerned about the fact that here in the U.S. market, because we work across borders, but in the U.S. market, the iPhone is a bit crippled relative to what Google has done on the Android side. So, for all of us here in the room, I could confidently say that if you were to download a Android app that is well rated, you can probably avoid most nuisance calls, right away. On iPhone, if you download an app, you actually have to go through settings. I was just playing with my phone here. It's settings and then a phone menu, and then you get down to call blocking identification to make this work. So most consumers, they don't understand that. So I think, about half the U.S. market, even though there are good apps available for iPhone, most consumers are unable to actually activate these services. So that's a problem. Otherwise, I think on the operator side, we're very excited to be working with an announced partner and some other folks as well. What I am concerned about there, though, is the industry's ability to find the right solutions, and it certainly doesn't have to be ours. It's a competitive marketplace. There's other companies out there. But maybe just to be a little bit controversial, because I think this is such an important issue. I don't really care if I step on some toes, because we got to solve this issue.
As long as it's not mine.
One is, how soon the spoofing issue is huge, and there's a lot that companies can do to combat bad callers and spoofing as well. But how fast can we actually move along on this? And I think Jim and Addis are doing some great work, and we're really eager to see something coming out. I think that there's some talk about how soon can a governing authority be placed into action, and we're very eagerly awaiting that. Is a foundation that will be that much stronger if a spoofing issue can be dealt with. The foundation that hundreds of companies are building their services on top of.
Good. Alex can talk a little about email.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about some of the other apps first, and then how email differs. I mean, the basic idea of a call blocking app is to decide when a number is a bad guy and not ring. That's sort of the default behavior of these, and everybody sort of has different ways they decide if a number is a bad guy. So at email, we took a slightly different approach, which is we didn't think hanging up was good enough. So when we detect somebody's a bad guy, we've actually replaced your mobile voicemail, and we play the bad guys that do-do-do, this number's out of service tone. And so what that does is it actually stops them from making the call. And so we took the approach that, like a lot of others, you want to try to block this at the source. The carriers try to do it at the network level. We try to fool the bad guys. So that's one thing we did. The second thing we realized is it's not black and white. It's easy to say good guy, bad guy. And certainly, an IRS scammer is a bad guy, and CVS telling you your prescription has arrived is a good guy. But there's a huge amount in the middle where some, robocalls are debt collectors who've called 50 times, or telemarketers. It's hard to tell if they're what's going on with them, whether they were wanted or not. So we took an approach that says if we think it's in the middle, we're not sure it's a bad guy, we just route them to voicemail without ringing your phone. So it turns out that replacing your voicemail has some nice effects. We can play the bad greeting, the do-do-do, and we can take the middle-of-the-road people, throw them into voicemail, and let consumers decide what they want to do.
So there's pluses and minuses in having lots of things to choose from. On the one hand, it's great. You can kind of sort through, and the other is sometimes you're overwhelmed. Anybody can comment on what the consumers' reactions, their experiences have been with this? Are they effective? I stumped the panel.
There's a lot of apps out there that are rated that have high ratings, and I think some of the solutions rolled out by the carriers have been very effective. I think we just heard of stats here that add up to at least 6 billion phone calls, I think, from bad actors being blocked recently. So I think it's starting to work. There's a lot more work that needs to be done still. I'm always concerned about maybe some actors, some companies being overly aggressive in too quickly fighting the bad robocallers. And basically, I think really what's needed is a scalpel in terms of ferreting out the bad callers from the good ones. And I think I am a bit concerned that there might be too many solutions that are more like a bazooka that can actually prevent legitimate calls from getting through.
So one thing we were surprised to find out is that consumers actually want the bazooka. So as an anecdote, on our Android app, we have a whitelist feature. And so the whitelist feature means if a caller is not in your contacts, your phone won't ring. Now, we did this as a setting. It's buried. You have to find it. I think you've got to tap 4 things. It's not even called whitelist. We named it badly. We just put it out there to say, does anybody want this? Turns out at the rate it's going, more consumers will have that on in our app than have it off. And so that's a bazooka, which is, look, if it's not somebody I already know, send them to voicemail.
Yeah, Mario?
I'll just note on our webpage, this is the Consumer Tips Robocalls page on our CTIA website. In order to try to help consumers parse through it, we've listed on each of the pages, the Android, iOS, BlackBerry, and Windows, the top apps, and they're based on user ratings, number of downloads, and most recent version date. But I've also attached PDFs of the entire app ecosystem per platform because I don't pick and choose. I want consumers to decide. But there is a way to, help consumers at least try some of the top-rated ones.
Whenever we give consumer advice, we try to play out exactly what we're saying to make sure that it's actually useful. So, of course, when call blocking apps first started coming out, and even after the FTC challenge, we would test some of these just to see if our general advice that this is a good idea was useful or not. And my personal experience a few years ago was downloading a third-party app, but then the call tried to ring through the app as opposed to through my regular phone app. And ultimately, we decided we weren't really ready for that. So the fact that we're saying now, really people should check out these apps is kind of significant. And there's a few ways that people can try to sort out what's best for them. Going to CTIA's site, if you want to check a list that's been curated, could be really useful. Also, just going on to the app stores and typing in your carrier with call blocking, you ought to be able to bring some up then. One of the things that consumers tell us is that their preferred price point is zero. So the first place a lot of people are going to want to start is to see what's offered through their carrier. I've been using one of the services that we've been talking about that's offered through my carrier, and it's night and day from what it was just a few years ago, in that now the call rings through my regular phone app. I'm using iOS. It labels some calls and blocks others, and provides a lot of information.
I know Alex touched on this. A couple of you actually touched on it. Is how do you distinguish the bad actors, the things you want to block from the things that should get through? Can you say a little bit, again, not for technical, but for consumers, about how does this work so that I make sure, maybe some choose to take the bazooka, but others, like I talked about, well, maybe this is a call I really wanted to have come through. How do you sort those things?
We're looking at a bit over 30 attributes, and our team in Seattle has a whole set of advanced algorithms to use machine learning techniques to, on a real-time basis, detect or really assign a reputation to the caller. It's a very it's really a daunting technical challenge. It's one of the things I'm excited about is that we don't actually have a so-called blacklist. We are looking at every call as an event on its own, and depending on what else we've seen on the network, we may choose to assign the call a bad or a good reputation. And the worst kind of reputation would result in a call actually being blocked. Very few calls actually result in being blocked and have that reputation, but those are, of course, the ones that get a lot of attention, and rightly so, because those calls can actually be dangerous, right? That's a fake IRS agent demanding money, and we're seeing a big rise in that volume. I think we're seeing a 1,200% increase this year compared to last year in the IRS scam. But then there's all these shades of gray. So then there's calls that we consider to be spammy or of a nuisance nature, and it's very subjective. Who considers that call nuisance or not? I mean, you can just look at party affiliation. When fundraising calls are coming through, there's about a 50-50 chance that the person's actually want to receive a call from that party, for example. I think there's been some mentions here about school alerts and so forth. Of course, it's important to receive those notifications. Given that our company is premised on fighting these bad calls, I think I can probably say a little bit more comfortably that that there's other examples too, in terms of like even debt collectors, for example. I changed my credit card recently, and had our service blocked out the debt collector from getting through to me, either my service would have been terminated, I would have been surprised by that, or my credit rating would have gone down the tubes. So it's important that some of these calls get through. There's over 2 million people employed in call centers in the U.S., never mind outside. And, a lot of these people are doing important work, and they need to get through to consumers. So we take this, false positive thing very seriously. Our reported false positive rate is 0.01%, and we're very proud of that.
And for others. Yeah, I'm particularly interested in what are the sorts of things, if you're trying it as a service provider, that are the clues that this is an unwanted call or an illegal call.
So
not going to talk about the specific clues, but I want to step back and just talk about how we need to approach this solution to be, this problem to be effective. And again, the key thing is how do you identify the bad actors, and how do you identify the good actors who might look a little bit like bad actors if you're not doing the right thing. And Shaken will help a little bit with that, but it doesn't solve it, because, as the geeks like to say, Dr. Evil can still go get a phone number and it will be fully attested, and it's still Dr. Evil. That doesn't mean that it's not a bad call. So that's part of it, but it's not all of it. And you can also be assured that as soon as we work out some technique to differentiate between the good and the bad actors, they're going to change the techniques. I mean, spoofing is used today because it works. When it stops working, they'll do something else. And where that's going, that's the bad news, if you will. The good news is where that goes is you need to have the stakeholders in all the key segments. The stakeholders in the Shaken ecosystem, the stakeholders in the call blocking, the apps, and the users, the people who actually want to get through. And the stakeholders from all those have to work together to identify the techniques. And that's not a one-shot thing, because, again, as soon as it starts to work, they'll change. And that's why you need to ensure that structure is flexible and ongoing, and it's flexible so that when they try something different, you come back, you look at it, you work out what needs to be done, and you change the way you're doing it on a time scale that is consistent with their time scale. So that flexibility and quick response of all the stakeholders is key. And if you have that, you're well positioned. If you don't have that, it's going to end badly.
Go ahead, Ron.
So we behave somewhat similar to Haya in that we have what we call a dynamic blacklist and a dynamic whitelist. So a dynamic blacklist is a whole bunch of factors of behavior of a given number that makes us believe that this particular call from this number is a bad thing. One of the things we do that we focus a lot of effort on, though, is recognizing the good calls to make sure we can let them through. So CVS calling, as you know, with your pharmacy prescription is a good example of that. And so we actually built some technology we call audio fingerprinting that looks at the voicemails and the audios that have been left by a given number at a given time. And from that, we can actually tell when another number is leaving something similar, is it good or is it bad? So a particular number called, we know that's CVS. Now another number calls, leaves the same sort of message. We know that that's also a CVS number. And so for us, it's really been looking at the content of the interactions that's been very key now in dynamically determining good, bad, or in between.
So I want to talk about a little bit the difference between good and bad, and I think there may be some difference of opinion on which group different callers fit. Looking at UMail's robocall index, the top 20 robocallers in February in the nation, 16 of them were debt collectors. They're not 2 of them would look like were scammers. 16 were debt collectors. So according to many debt collectors' manuals, they will call as many as 10 times a day to collect each account. Many student loan borrowers have 8 accounts. So they're subject to getting 80 calls a day from a debt collector. Now, is that debt collector a good or a bad guy? I'll just leave it at that.
Depends whether there's a debt.
Well, even if there's a debt, 80 calls a day may be too much.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else on the distinction? Nope. So the solutions, I mentioned at the start, the number that looks like it comes from New York in spoofing. Are the things that we've been talking about effective against spoofing? How does that come into play?
Yeah, there's a bit of a myth out there that nothing can be done against spoofing until Shaken takes place or is fully implemented, and I think we need to get it in place as quickly as possible. But we're seeing almost 30% of nuisance calls today are the so-called neighbor spoofing scam, and these are typically scam calls. And if you're not familiar with it, it's basically these bad actors, they'll call you, whatever number you have, and the originating number has the same 6 digits in the beginning. Sometimes they actually replicate your whole number, so they call you from your own number, and I think some people are curious to see who's calling. But usually it's the first six digits. And we have some techniques to actually ferret that out, and the clumsy technique, for example, would be to block any call that comes in from those first 6 digits, but then you might block out people who just happen to randomly have a similar phone number to you. Now, I can't tell you what technique we're using, because if any of these guys are watching this video, that probably...
I'm sure they wouldn't.
that technique would no longer be effective. But that is an example of spoofing, where actually, if you're smart about how you go about it, you can actually block out those calls.
I just want to just build on Alex's point about you can do a lot without Shaken. The way I look at Shaken is again, there's very effective techniques that have been built today, but in many sense, because it's spoofing, the foundation has weaknesses. And what Shaken is doing is providing a firm foundation for those things. They'll be the same apps, they'll just be able to do that much more effective, more powerful, more accurate assessment. And so it's, again, why I talk about it as an enabler. But again, we don't have to wait for it, but I'm sure it'll help the sooner it's there.
So 2 comments. One is we're already seeing the neighborhood spoofers get smarter by changing their definition of a neighborhood. It used to be NPA and XX, your first 6 digits had to match, so only the last 4 would be different. Then we started seeing the 5 digits would match, or 4 digits would match. And so it turns out it's a really hard problem. And I think what's happened, at least with our user base, is they're deciding, I'd rather just whitelist. I'd rather just say, you know what, there's too many of those calls that are getting through. I don't want them anymore. I'm going to restrict it to my contacts. Everybody else who calls me who I want to hear from again, I'll put in my contacts. So I think consumers are sort of taking it into their own hands and dealing with that problem.
So let's talk a little bit about the progress on caller ID authentication. We've been touching on this. So where are we on that, and what's involved in accomplishing it? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So let's just, again, step back. So it was in January of 2017, the Shaken spec was published. Shortly after that, Addis partnered with Newstar to provide a test bed, a Shaken test bed available to the industry. That is continuing to be available at no cost as of today. We've had, as of recently, we've had over a half dozen either vendors or providers who have completed testing. We have a similar number who are actively in the process of testing, as well as others who are watching and getting ready. So all of that is proceeding in terms of the infrastructure to deploy that. In terms of the governance authority, we issued the governance, the Shaken governance framework document about the middle of last year, and our intention when we did that was that, frankly, by about now, we would have the governance authority set up and beginning to get the processes in place. I talked about the need for the various stakeholders to share information and to work together to work out how we respond to that, and that's the kind of thing that would do. To be honest, the trust anchor notice of inquiry kind of slowed that down a little bit, and we're not set up and running now. We're hoping that as the Nancy CATA working group finishes up its work over the next month or so, that will get that process up and running. And really the key thing here is that because of that need for all the stakeholders to be involved, to understand each other's problems and perspectives, and be prepared for reacting to the bad guys, you actually need to have the governance authority up and running almost before you actually have it deployed in the network. You don't want to deploy it and then try to figure out how to manage the thing after the fact. So it's moving forward. We want it to move forward faster.
I would just add, yes. So we have the framework developed. The testing is being done. I encourage all carriers to get on board with that testing if you haven't tested already. And as far as the Nancy's work, we're working towards that report with our recommendations by May of this year, and I'm hopeful that the FCC takes the recommendation, whatever it is, because we haven't finished it, to set up that governance structure as quickly as possible so we can get this going.
So I think we heard this question on the last panel, which was really focused, I think, more on the enforcement side. What do we do after it happens, and to discourage it through enforcement. But what, from your perspective, can the government do to encourage continued development of solutions across the board to anyone?
Well, I was going to say, I think what the goal should be is a vibrant ecosystem of different apps. I mean, carriers should do what they can do, but you really want a whole bunch of different apps because that's where all the really interesting innovation is taking place. Not just our app, but I look at a lot of apps all the time, and there's lots of interesting ideas on how to get better at stopping these calls. And so the question then becomes, how do you get that ecosystem? And the main way you get it is by providing access to the platforms, having the carrier, driving the carriers to open more things up to the app so they have the data that they use or network elements they can use, to drive the handset makers and the carriers to make it easy to sign up and use these apps. Like Alex gave a great example on the iPhone where it's really a bear to turn on blocking. He left out that Apple has a fixed list. You can have up to, I think it's 1.5 million numbers that you have to load as an app into the iPhone to say, don't let these ring, block these things. That's a crazy way to do it versus Android, which at least lets apps get into the middle of a call and hang up, although Android has its own set of problems there. So I think getting the government to help push these folks into driving an ecosystem would be really good for everybody, because I think you never know where the next great solution is going to be.
So it's interesting to me that the engineers think the fix is with the engineering and the lawyers think the fix is with the law.
Welcome to my life.
Actually, as a lawyer, I think the fix is with the engineering. But the law still has a very important place.
Of course.
As was mentioned in the previous panel, there was a decision last week by the D.C. Circuit Court that really throws the definition of auto dialer back to the FCC. And that is a really critical question that will have tremendous ramifications about what types of calls are considered covered by that consumer protection law. If the FCC moves forward as the calling industry would like it to, and does not include within that definition many of the types of equipment that are currently generating the calls, then those calls won't be covered by that law, and all the calls on which a human is actually talking to the receiver, the person who's getting the call, there will be no coverage, no requirement that the consumer has to consent. Much more importantly, no ability of the consumer to say, stop calling me, and have a law require that caller stop calling. As I described a minute ago with the debt collection calls, the ability for a consumer to be able to say stop calling for these automated calls is really a critical consumer protection, whether that caller is in the white list or the gray list or the black list. The FTC rules, which are also very important, do not cover these robocalls that have a human at the end. They only cover pre-recorded and artificial voice. So the whole burden really will be on the Federal Communications Commission to make sure to cover these calls so that consumers have some ability to control them.
Got it.
I don't have an opinion on enforcement, but I think in terms of what the FCC and FTC have been doing as a newcomer to DC, I mean, we're pretty much holed up in our little tech bubble on the West Coast most of the time. It's been really nice to see what an effective spark took place a couple of years ago here, and it's stoked all sorts of good conversation around spoofing, and action is taking place now. I am a little bit concerned about there being maybe too much discourse about coverage or the ability to detect these bad callers. And maybe not as much on the false positives. And we're taking a very long-term view at this, and I ultimately want there to be as much innovation and solutions available to customers. But I think there was an example just recently with a self-driving car hitting someone, and now that's shut down innovation for temporarily for self-driving cars. I can think of all sorts of awful scenarios that would take place if too many calls are blocked. And I'm not going to give specific examples, but they are, some of them are actually life or death. And I don't think that it's necessarily government's role to enforce how this happens, but I think just elevating the cost of false positives more into the discussion, I think, would be really healthy to make sure that innovation will continue in the long run as rapidly as possible.
This sort of information sharing is really important and valuable. I think a specific area where continuing to have a conversation among industry and industry associations and government will be in the labeling of calls. There's been some really interesting work that's going on. It's going to be even more important as the new call authentication standards come into effect, so that people understand that if they get a green or a yellow or a red, what that means, and that it not be unique across every type of device. The other kind of information sharing that's really important is the actual data about calls and what people are reporting. We're really happy that we've been able to take the information that people report to us. It's really important that if people have a bad experience a scammy call, to report it to ftc.gov/complaint. They can always report unwanted calls if they're on the National Do Not Call Registry at donotcall.gov. And we're now making that information available, as was mentioned earlier, on a daily basis, so that can help make the algorithm smarter, better inform the blacklists. And so, both types of information sharing are really important.
Good. We're down to the last few minutes that were scheduled for our panel. Any final thoughts that you wanted to add that we didn't cover?
I'm just glad the lawyers and the engineers are all on the same panel. So.
That's right. Well, just ask one. Go ahead, Nate.
Well, I'm just saying that it really is exciting, the amount of innovation. I mean, Lois and I go back to having worked in the National Do Not Call Registry, which was now 15 and more years ago, and we get it. It doesn't stop unwanted calls now, but we feel like we've come into an area where there's a lot of really promising technologies that are doing that and are going to do it even better. So we hope people, regular people, will take advantage of those and check out some of these apps and services and devices. If they go to ftc.gov/calls, they can learn generally how to do that, and going to places like CTIA and checking out some of the apps in the App Store are going to give them a good result.
I would just say the work is not done, and we're going to continue working at it with partnership with the FCC, FTC, the wireline, wireless industry, everyone at this table, the third-party app developers. And unfortunately, the illegal robocallers are going to keep at it, and so we can't just, sit on our laurels even after call authentication gets up and running. Even with the 550 apps out there, we got to keep fighting every day.
Go ahead.
I would actually support that totally. Is that this is a long haul. It will get better. It probably will, unfortunately, take longer than we'd like, and we need to keep at it. One of the things that I always bristle at when people talk about solutions to this problem, I think it's the wrong mindset. This is a long struggle that we need to keep working at. Again, it will get better, but it will never be quote unquote solved. So let's keep going.
I won't yield, so it'll never get solved. It'll be an ongoing battle. But I do think I want to thank the panelists, and it's encouraging that all the work that has been done, and there's progress being made. I know we're still, working to try to have the numbers turn in the opposite direction.
That we can do.
And it just underscores the importance, I think, of government, industry, third-party providers, and all of the stakeholders, the consumer interests as well, all pulling together to tackle this problem. So thank you, and give you a round of applause.
Thank you to Julie and our third panel panelists. Finally, we have closing remarks from Svetlana Gans. She is Chief of Staff to FTC Acting Chairman Olhausen. Svetlana.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am going to close out the show by providing a brief summary of kind of what we've heard during today's program. You've heard that robocalls are on the rise due to the advances of technology. The FTC receives 400,000 complaints about unwanted calls a day. There's been 4.5 million complaints in 2017 and $9.5 billion in consumer losses. We are working very hard with the Federal Communications Commission to fight robocalls. This is a top priority at the Federal Trade Commission and at the FCC. It is imperative that federal, state, industry, and consumer groups collaborate to find a solution to the problem, and that it's a holistic solution. We also heard about data sharing and how it's extremely important to fight robocalls. Data sharing is important in multiple respects. One is for consumers to continue to notify the FTC and FCC concerning unwanted robocalls, and to also file complaints online. The FTC is publishing complaint data daily, which is helping in the fight. Lastly, companies are sharing information with each other to trace back illegal robocalls. So all of these data sharing mechanisms are very important. We talked about some potential solutions or strategies, not to say solutions. We talked about potential legislative solutions, including repealing the common carrier exemption of FTC jurisdiction. We spoke about strengthening the FCC's authority in elevating the statute of limitation from 1 year to 2 years. And we also talked about the potential to increase penalties for robocallers. We also talked about industry solutions. We called industry to act, to conduct additional outreach for consumers on call blocking technologies, and to continue to innovate and deploy new technologies in this area. We also talked about what government can do, which is to foster an ecosystem in which companies can thrive and continue to innovate in this area. Lastly, we talked about the wealth of potential consumer solutions for this problem. We heard that there are over 550 apps available in the App Store to try to curb illegal robocalls, and that there are some resources available from CTIA and other outlets on ranking them to enable consumers to make an informed choice about the apps that work for them. As you know, we will be having a Robocall Tech Expo on April 23rd. Flyers are available in the back of the room. We are still seeking exhibitors, so if you are a carrier or an app developer or another technology company in the space that's working on a solution, we welcome you to reach out to the FCC to showcase your work at the Robocall Tech Expo on April 23rd. Additional information is available at the back of the room. And lastly, I like to just reference the two websites that folks can turn to for additional assistance or information concerning robocalls. One is the FTC website, www.ftc.gov/calls. The other one is the FCC website, fcc.gov/robocalls. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. We look forward to working with you all on potential solutions and strategies going forward. So thank you very much.